You will not survive this story. Not because it is cruel, but because it is honest. They asked me to speak, so I did. And I haven't stopped since. My name is Edric Solon, once a monk, now something else entirely. This is not a tale for daylight. But you didn't come here for peace, did you? You came to know what they tried to bury beneath silence. You came to know what S3X was really like in the Middle Ages. So listen closely. Close your eyes and follow me back. It begins in a place no one wants to talk about. A monastery, cold stone, wet floors, silence thick enough to strangle you. They called it St. Helene's. I called it a cage with hymns. I was 17 when I first arrived. Skin too clean, mind too curious. They shaved my head, took my name, gave me God, but not the warm, loving kind, the one that watched you sleep, counted your dreams, took notes on your urges, and still, I wanted to believe. For a while, until the first winter. That year, frost cracked the windows, and even the rats moved slower. We slept 5 to a room, wool blankets, shared heat, colder prayers. One night, Brother Lucian touched my ankle beneath the covers. Accident? Maybe. The next night it wasn't. He didn't speak, just curled closer, breathing slow, his thigh against mine like a question neither of us wanted to ask. But our bodies did the asking, and our silence answered. After, we went to morning prayer as if nothing had happened. But something had. Desire, once tasted, never fully leaves. It clings, like wine on robes. We tried to pray it away. We fasted, flagellated. Lucien spent 3 days without food. I walked barefoot across the snow. One monk threw himself into a thorn bush. Still, the thoughts came. Worse than hunger. Worse than pain. Because at least hunger ends. Lust just waits. They said the devil sent the dreams. They said to wake up sweating was a punishment. They said touching yourself was like nailing Christ to the cross again. They had pamphlets about it. Illustrations even. A man caught in sin, his hands ablaze, his eyes blackened. They left them on our pillows. A bedtime story of shame. One evening, a young novice confessed to me. He'd had a dream. A woman with black eyes and hair like oil. She kissed him, spoke his name. He woke up soaked. He cried for 3 days straight. They made him fast until he fainted. The next time I saw him, he was humming to himself in the garden, picking imaginary flowers. He never spoke again. The church feared S3X more than it feared war, because war was honest. Desire wasn't. Desire could hide in smiles, in scripture, in the touch of hands during prayer. And worst of all, desire made people disobey. There was a monk named Mathieu. He carved prayers into his forearms. He said it helped, that the pain drowned out the filth in his mind. One night, I found him unconscious. Blood pooled like spilled ink. He survived, but he never stopped cutting. We had a confessor named Father Baron. He asked too many questions. It's not just what you did, but how, where, when, who watched. Sometimes I thought he was writing a book. Once I confessed a dream. He leaned in too close, asked if I'd felt warmth. I lied, said no. He smiled. He knew I was lying. But let me tell you the secret. They all knew. The brothers, the priests, even the abbot. They just didn't want anyone to speak it aloud. Because if one of us admitted it, all of them would have to. There was a tunnel beneath the monastery. They said it led to the wine cellar. They lied. It led to a library, a private one. Not psalms, not gospels, writings, poems, diaries, drawings. Some holy, some not. I found a parchment once. It read, "The Lord kissed me where no prayer had touched." Another, I dreamed of an angel who entered me and whispered Latin into my mouth. Another, she wept, and I drank it like wine. These weren't sinners. These were saints, canonized, celebrated. Their lust made divine by metaphor. You see the trick? Call it God, and no one flinches. We had rituals. We pretended they were sacred. Night prayers with candles low. We wore robes with nothing beneath. Sat beside one another, knees touching. Sang in Latin, words we barely understood. Sometimes a hand would stray, sometimes more. After, we'd confess and start over. It was theater, a cycle. Sin, guilt, confession, relief, repeat. The church didn't want to stop it. They wanted to own it. One night, I asked the abbot if we could speak plainly. He said, "The body is a door. Open it too wide, and the devil walks through." I asked what happens if the door opens by itself. He said, "Then we fast harder." I asked what if fasting doesn't work. He said, "Then we pray while we bleed." I stopped praying after that. But I kept listening, because the walls had stories, and I wasn't done hearing them, not yet. There was a nun named Sister Alira. We never met face to face, but we wrote letters. We hid them beneath the altar cloth, folded tight, written in lemon juice. You had to heat them with a candle to read the words. Her first letter said, "I dream of mouths I've never kissed." Her second said, "I want to know what prayer feels like between thighs." Her third said nothing, just a drawing of two hands, interlocked. They found her letters eventually. She was sent to a convent in the north, cold, strict, known for silence. She never wrote again. One of the brothers, Simon, snapped one night, started shouting in the cloister, said the Virgin Mary kissed him, said she used tongue. They locked him in the cellar for a week. When they let him out, he spoke perfect Latin. He'd never studied it before. We didn't ask questions. We just listened and stayed quiet. It wasn't always tragic. Sometimes it was funny. A monk once got caught sneaking into the laundry chamber. He said he liked the smell of soap. They found Sister Alandra's veil under his robe. He claimed it blew there in the wind. We didn't believe him, but we let him keep the story. Once I heard two novices arguing, not about sin, about technique. One swore that kissing beneath the chin led to impure dreams. The other said touching the wrist was worse. They kept score of their dreams in chalk on the wall behind the candle shelf. By the end of the month, it looked like a scoreboard at a tavern. Even in shame, there was a strange sort of joy, a knowing, a bond, like prisoners who share the same key. We weren't holy. We were hungry for touch, for softness, for a moment without rules. There's a saying we had, better to burn now than forever. Some took it literally. Brother Enoch held his hand over flame to kill desire. He lasted 6 seconds. His hand blistered for weeks. Desire came back in 4 days. He cried harder than he did from the burn. Eventually, we learned to live in between. Not chaste, not free, just careful. Careful with touches, careful with glances, careful with breath in the dark. And me? I stopped counting sins after 42. I stopped confessing after 50. After 60, I started writing them down. Not for penance, for memory. Because here's the truth they never told us. Sin is not the opposite of holiness. It's the proof of it. Without sin, there is no struggle. Without struggle, no salvation. And without salvation, what's the point of the robe? They buried my journals, burned the pages, said I was possessed. Maybe I was. Maybe I still am. But I remember. Every touch, every prayer said through clenched teeth, every night spent with guilt folded into the sheets. And I'll keep telling you, because you're still listening, aren't you? The first time I entered the confessional, I wasn't even sure what to say. I thought I'd prepared. I made a list. Sins I'd imagined, Sins I'd heard about, sins I wasn't even sure were real. I thought if I confessed them all, I'd be safe. That's not how it works. The booth smelled like wax and sweat, wood, carved with initials I didn't recognize. The seat was hard. The screen between us, thin. I could hear him breathing on the other side. Not like a priest, like a man. "Speak, my son," he said. So I did. I had a dream. What kind? Of a woman. She smiled. Was she clothed? No. A pause, then a soft sound. Pen on paper. Go on. It lasted 15 minutes. By the end, I'd admitted to thoughts I'd never dared say aloud. And when I emerged, I didn't feel clean. I felt exposed, like I'd undressed for someone and wasn't sure if I liked it or not. Confession, they say, is a cleansing. But no one tells you what happens when the priest enjoys it. Some took notes. Some asked for detail. One even asked me to describe the scent. What was I supposed to say? That it smelled like lavender and ash and the edge of something holy? I lied. Said I didn't remember. He smiled. He knew I did. We confessed every week. Some of us, every day. Wasn't always about what we'd done. Sometimes just what we'd thought. What we wanted. What we almost did. And in time, we learned the truth. The booth way isn't there to cleanse us. It was there to record us. There was a brother named Elias. Quiet. Pale. Always chewing his sleeve. He confessed the same sin every day. Same dream. Same woman. Same moment. Over. And over. And over. No one stopped him. They just kept recording. One day, the confessor switched. A new voice behind the screen. Elias lasted 2 questions before he screamed, ran out of the booth, tore his robes off in the courtyard, and wept until he vomited. He was gone by morning. All they said was, transferred. We never asked where. There was no privacy. The walls were thin. If you pressed your ear to the confessional from the outside, you could hear the whole thing. Some of the younger brothers did it for fun. Took bets on who'd admit to touching themselves. Kept a tally. It was called the Scroll of Shame. They hid it behind a loose brick in the apothecary. I read it once. My name was on it. Twice. I asked once, what if I confess something I haven't done? The priest said, then you've named the desire. And that's still sin? He paused. Yes. So I stopped waiting to sin. I just started confessing. Things I dreamed. Things I read. Things I saw in the shadows between candles. And you know what happened? Nothing. They just kept listening. Kept nodding. Kept assigning penance. Like a baker weighing loaves. 5 Hail Marys for a kiss. 10 for a thought. 20 if it ended with a stain. Some monks got creative. One confessed to lusting after a statue. The Virgin Mary. He swore her eyes moved, that her lips parted, that her foot lifted, as if to step down and touch him. They made him recite the Psalms naked in the snow. It didn't help. He kept dreaming. Another claimed his dreams were in Latin, that the woman spoke scripture while straddling him. He said he woke up speaking verses he'd never memorized. He was beaten. Hard. But not for the dream. For the pride. You see, it wasn't about purity. It was about obedience. If your sins made you submissive, they forgave you. If your sins made you question, they punished you. One brother, Thomas, confessed to enjoying the punishment. He said the shame felt warm. He said the lashes made his thoughts cleaner. They chained him for a month. When they let him out, he asked for more. He wasn't allowed to confess again. There were whispers that some priests used the booth to seduce, not with touch, with words. They'd say things like, describe it slower. Was your heart racing? Did you wish it lasted longer? They never touched you, but you left the booth feeling like you'd been touched everywhere. There was no one to report it to. They were the system. The screen, the robe, the title. It protected them. and trapped us. I once asked an older monk, "Did you ever feel clean after confession?" He laughed, said, "Clean? No, but quieter." That's when I knew. It wasn't about redemption. It was about silence. So I stopped confessing, started writing. These words you're hearing? They're my real confessions. Not for forgiveness, not for shame, for truth. Because one day, someone will find these words. Someone like you. And they'll ask, was it really like that? Did they really punish dreams? Did they really turn sin into theater? And I'll answer, yes, and worse. And you haven't even heard the half of it. Not yet. Let me tell you something you already suspect. In the Middle Ages, everything was a sin. Not just the obvious things. Breathing too loudly during prayer. Sin. Thinking about someone's hands too long. Sin. Waking up with sweat between your legs. Automatic sin. And the best part? They kept inventing more. There was a book we weren't allowed to see. Locked in the abbot's chamber. They called it The Mirror of Faults. A thick, leather-bound list of every possible sin they'd ever imagined. Not things people did. Things people could do. Or might do. Or almost did, in dreams they didn't even ask for. It had over 2,000 entries. We snuck it out once, read it by candlelight. I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my own shame. You could sin by accidentally lusting, by standing too close, by wearing your robe too loose at the collar. If you crossed your legs wrong, they said it tempted the angels. If your voice cracked during a hymn, you were trying to sound seductive. If your foot tapped to music, that was a dance of the flesh. There was a sin for how long you looked, and a different sin for what you were thinking while you looked. Even if you didn't act on it, didn't matter. Intent was enough. They called it internal fornication. Sounds like a disease, doesn't it? It was. One you were born with. There were sin scales, lists, charts. One monk swore that kissing someone on the lips was less sinful than touching their hair, because lips could lie. But longing? That lived in the fingertips. They told us a story about a saint who bit off his own tongue to stop thinking impure thoughts. Said he went to heaven early. We weren't sure if that was a reward or a cover-up. Do you know how they taught us modesty? With shame. Public lectures. One priest made Brother Aldrich stand in the refectory and explain why the shape of his mouth made others stumble. Aldrich cried. I don't blame him. He had a beautiful mouth. We weren't allowed to bathe alone. You'd think it was for accountability. No. They said the warmth of the water encouraged sin. They believed comfort led to softness, and softness led to surrender. So we bathed cold, together, in silence, with eyes down. Except, not always. There was one brother who kept a stone in his bed to remind himself not to enjoy sleep. Every night he'd curl around it like it was a wound. He died young. We all told each other it was holiness that killed him. But I think it was exhaustion. You could sin by laughing too loudly, by dreaming about food, by remembering someone's scent, by humming a tune that reminded you of your mother. Affection was dangerous. Even platonic love was suspect, especially if it felt too warm. I once held a fellow novice's hand too long during morning prayer, just long enough to notice the shape of his knuckles. I confessed it. I was told to fast for 7 days. He never looked at me again. That was the real punishment. They invented sins so they'd never run out of reasons to control you. I once asked a question during a lecture on purity. Can beauty be sin? The lecturer paused, said, only if you notice it. I said, then why did God make it? He didn't answer. I wasn't allowed to speak in lectures for a month. There were forbidden topics: bodies, touch, warmth, dreams. If you asked about any of them, you were watched. If you asked twice, you were isolated. 3 times. You were invited to reflect. That meant silence, no eye contact, no speaking, no writing. Some monks never came back from reflection. Some came back quieter, too quiet, like the silence never left. They said joy was dangerous. Pleasure meant pride, and pride meant distance from God. So we were taught to mistrust joy, even small ones, like soft bread, or sunshine, or the sound of someone humming in the cloister garden. I once told a priest that I liked the color blue in stained glass. He made me kneel for an hour and say the miserere until my knees bled. He said beauty was a distraction. I still remember that window, even after it was shattered in a storm. I remember it better than most people I lived with. Every room had rules. Every hour had expectations. Even how we sat had to follow form. Too relaxed, laziness, too upright, vanity. There was no correct way to be, only ways to fail. The sin I hated most? The sin of unsanctioned delight. It meant any happiness not tied directly to God. A bite of sweet apple, a secret smile during a hymn, a memory that made your heart ache in a good way. All of it. Sin. One brother confessed he liked the feel of wind on his face. They made him wear a hood for 3 weeks, said the air was not his to enjoy. Some kept lists of their thoughts. I saw one once. Not actions, just thoughts. I thought of her voice. I imagined his wrist. I remembered a kiss from childhood. Each entry had a penance, each line written like a crime report. It made us lie. We lied so much, we forgot what truth felt like. And sometimes, we stopped knowing the difference. Want to know how bad it got? There was a monk who confessed to wanting to be touched in a dream. He didn't even dream it. He just wished he would. They locked him in a cell for 2 weeks. By the time they let him out, he said he'd been touched, but not by what he hoped for. You're probably thinking this sounds impossible, like fiction. But I lived it. I breathed it. I wrote it down because someone had to. And because even now, centuries later, you're still told to fear your body. The system hasn't changed, just evolved. But I'll keep telling these stories. Not to scandalize, to free. Because the only thing worse than sin is silence. Some sins didn't even need to be real. If someone suspected it, that was enough. There was a brother once, quiet and slow, always smiling. He tended the herb garden, hummed while he worked. One evening, a younger monk said he'd looked at him too gently. That was it. By morning, the smiling brother was gone. No trial, no questioning, just gone. The herbs wilted by the end of the week. We never spoke his name again. They taught us that wanting to be loved was weakness, but craving suffering? That was virtue. They said pain purged sin. So we leaned into it. One year, during Lent, Brother Holden tied nettles around his thighs. Said it reminded him of the thorns on Christ's crown. His skin turned red and raw. The abbot praised him. Another brother slept on a wooden board, with nails hammered upward, points dulled just enough not to pierce. He said comfort was the enemy of the soul. But in the mornings, he walked like someone twice his age. His bones ached for days. There was always one who tried to be perfect. Always. And they always broke. The perfectionists fell the hardest, because they had the most to lose. I remember one, Brother Taven. Beautiful voice, clean face, never raised his voice, never broke a rule, until he did. He confessed to feeling warmth when another monk brushed against him. Just warmth. He tried to fast it away, cut himself, begged for isolation. Still, the warmth stayed. So he burned his own hand. They called it holy courage. I called it tragedy. Taven died during Vespers one evening. Just collapsed. Heart failure, they said. We all knew it wasn't his heart. It was the weight of perfection. There was a girl once brought to the monastery for purification. 14. Her mother said she was too curious, that she touched herself. They brought her to us because they thought we could fix it. I wasn't allowed near her, but I heard her scream at night. She stayed for a month. When she left, she wouldn't speak, not even to her mother. Her name was Elira. I still dream of her face. They said silence was purity, but sometimes silence is just damage, with no voice left. And you know the most twisted part? The people who created all these sins, they didn't follow them. The ones who invented the rules, they broke them in secret. A priest once told me I was unclean for dreaming of a woman. 2 days later, I saw him behind the vestry with the butcher's wife. Her dress was lifted. His eyes were closed. When he opened them, he saw me, and didn't even flinch, just smiled, like it was my sin for watching. That's how it worked. Power rewrote sin. If you were holy enough, nothing stained you. But if you were small, even a thought could damn you. You want to know what really counted as sin? Existing, breathing, touching the world and enjoying it. That's what they feared. Pleasure without permission. Joy without guilt. Intimacy without a price. So they made everything dangerous. Every pleasure came with a punishment. Every smile came with suspicion. Even dream. Us weren't safe. We learned to shrink, to edit ourselves, to rehearse our thoughts before thinking them. Because if someone caught even a flicker of warmth in your eyes, that was enough. Enough to be marked, to be questioned, to be broken. Sometimes I think back to that list. The mirror of faults. I remember one entry, just 3 words. Joy without cause. I asked once, what if joy is the cause? They didn't answer. They just told me to kneel. But here's what they couldn't stop. The glances, the secret letters, the fingertips that lingered, the dreams that returned, the hunger that refused to be named, the whisper in the dark asking, "Are you like me?" I was. Still am. And I know you are too. That's why you're listening. Because you felt it. That little flicker they tried to kill. The part of you that wants warmth without shame. The part that aches for softness without permission. The part that says, I'm human, and that's enough. They told us everything was sin, so we turned everything into rebellion. A touch, a breath, a thought of something better. I leave you with this. If everything is sin, then nothing is. And maybe that's what scared them most. Let me start with a question. What do you think happens when you lock up desire? Hide it behind walls. Wrap it in linen. Call it holy. Pretend it doesn't breathe. You think it dies? No. It gets clever. It puts on a robe, speaks Latin, lights a candle, and waits until no one's looking. They said monasteries were sacred. They said convents were pure. But behind those walls, behind those stone gates and layers of silence, people were still people. And loneliness makes strange things beautiful. Even sin. Let me tell you about the nuns. Yes, them. They didn't all spend their days in perfect silence, praying until they floated off the floor. They laughed. They fought. They bled. They dreamed. And they got very creative. There was a convent just beyond the river. High walls, narrow gates, known for its strictness. They called it the Garden of Restraint. Inside lived 30 women. Only 5 had chosen to be there. The rest were placed by fathers, brothers, noble titles, debts, shame, or silence. Some were barely 14. Some were 40 and furious. There was one named Clara, sharp-tongued, hair like dried wheat, eyes like thunderclouds. She kept a diary hidden in the spine of a hymn book. How do I know? Because I read it. Every page. She wrote, "Today, Sister Magda braided my hair and touched my shoulder. Her fingers stayed a moment too long. I think she wanted to say something. But silence has a weight. Another entry. I woke up too close to her again. We share a mattress in winter. She said my breathing calmed her. I said nothing. But I didn't move away. And another. I had a dream. Not of angels. Of skin. Of lips not praying. They weren't allowed to sleep alone. Too cold. Too poor. 2 to a bed. Sometimes 3. They called it practicality. But it was more than that. It was proximity. And proximity is the first prayer of longing. They weren't allowed mirrors, but some polished spoons to see themselves. Not out of vanity, out of loneliness. When the world tells you not to desire anything, you start with your own face, just to remember you exist. I knew a nun who wrote poems in the margins of Bibles. She wrote about longing, about fire, about the warmth of another's hand under the table during silent meals. One line stuck with me. Your touch beneath the linen made me believe in something kinder than God. They said their love was spiritual, platonic, sisterhood. But language is flexible, and when you're not allowed to say, I want, you say, I dream, or I ache, or she makes me feel, and leave the sentence unfinished. Some nuns passed notes folded into the bindings of their books. They used pressed flowers as signals, red for longing, white for caution, blue for meet me in the vestry. I learned that code from one who left. Her name was Lina. She told me once, I would have rather died, loved and condemned than live untouched and praised. I never saw her again. I still don't know if she left willingly or was sent away. The priests tried to stop it. They assigned confession partners. They ordered surprise inspections. They forbade sisters from spending more than 30 minutes alone together. But nothing worked. Desire always finds the gaps. Want to hear something strange? In one convent, they invented a punishment for excessive affection. What does that mean? No one defined it. Just that if 2 nuns were seen sitting too close, they'd be separated. Forced to pray in opposite corners of the chapel. Some called it the colding. You weren't beaten. You were just denied warmth. Sometimes that hurt more. But this isn't just about the nuns. The monks, they were worse. Weirder, wilder, and more desperate. One brother trained himself not to dream. Said he focused on psalms as he fell asleep. If a sinful image appeared, he imagined thorns, or fire, or Christ's blood. He said it worked, until it didn't. He woke up screaming one night, said an angel had kissed him in his sleep. He wept for an hour, then fasted for 12 days. Another monk confessed to craving penance, not because he wanted forgiveness, because the pain made him feel seen. Still another began writing letters, to no one. He called them letters to the body. They weren't addressed. He'd hide them in the walls. I found one once. It read, I miss the sound of laughter that isn't rehearsed. I miss touch without fear. There was a monk named Silas. He believed beauty was dangerous, so he blinded himself. Not fully. He dripped candle wax into his eyes during prayer, just enough to blur the edges of faces, to dull the glow of skin. He said the world looked holier in a haze. He walked into walls for weeks. Then there was Brother Reynold. He developed a ritual. Every time he felt desire, he buried a stone. By the end of the year, he'd made a path, from the chapel to the stables. We called it the Lust Road. He never found peace, but the horses appreciated the cleared trail. We once had a brother who claimed to be free of all temptation. He smiled too often, prayed too loudly, slept too soundly. We didn't believe him, and one night, someone followed him, down to the cloister cellar. He wasn't alone. They said nothing, officially, but he disappeared 2 days later. His cell was scrubbed clean. Too clean. Let me tell you about the Chamber of Discipline. Not every monastery had one. Ours did. A small stone room beneath the sanctuary. One candle. One bench. One whip. You were sent there if you confessed recurring desires. Sometimes alone, sometimes not. The whip was leather, but the gilt was iron. I was sent once for dreaming too vividly, for writing something too soft. A line of poetry about a mouth I hadn't kissed. They found it. They read it aloud at morning prayer, laughed, then sent me down. 2 lashes, one for the dream, one for the ink. But here's what they never expected. I liked the silence of that room, not the pain, but the privacy, the quiet. No rules down there, no eyes watching, just me and the memory. Desire didn't die in those places. It matured. It learned to wear masks, to sound like scripture, to breathe through hymns, to touch without touching. I remember a monk who used to write psalms backwards, not to be blasphemous, to confuse his thoughts. He said if he stayed disoriented, lust couldn't catch him. He lasted a year, then broke. Hard. Confessed during a funeral mass. Said he saw God's face, and it was made of every man he'd ever wanted. They isolated him, called it purification. He sang to himself for 6 days straight. On the 7th, he stopped. There were nights when the dormitory smelled like sin, not incense, not candle wax. Sin. Warm, human, thick. But no one said a word. Just tighter blankets, longer prayers, and eyes that refused to meet in the morning. Some monks made pacts, agreements. We will not touch. We will not speak. We will not look. But their hands always shook. Their steps faltered. They wrote names into the condensation on windows, names erased before morning, but still there, always still there. Sister Aline once said, "I fear not the devil in dreams. I fear waking up alone." Do you understand now? The loneliness wasn't punishment. It was the design. Because if you're lonely long enough, you'll confess anything, even things you didn't do, just to be touched. They thought isolation would lead to holiness, but it only ever led to craving. More monks broke than confessed. More nuns cried themselves to sleep than sang. But they didn't record those parts in the books. They only kept the prayers, not the silence that followed. One winter, the snow came early. The cloister froze. Pipes cracked. Meals shrank. Tempers grew sharp. That's when the weirdness really started. Brother Emmerich began speaking in his sleep. Latin at first, then Greek, then something older. No one recognized the words, but the way he said them, like love letters whispered through a locked door. They tried exorcism 3 times. The 3rd time he laughed, said the devil had softer hands than God. They removed his tongue 2 days later. He lived, but never smiled again. Sister Risa refused to eat. She said she'd tasted something better. They thought it was madness, until they found her in the chapel, face wet, breath trembling. She whispered, "He came to me in light. I opened my mouth to sing, but he filled it with warmth." The priest slapped her across the face. She didn't flinch. She just laughed. Softly, like she'd won something. One monk tried to purify himself through silence. No speech, no sound, not even humming. He lasted 40 days. On the 41st, he burst into the chapel and screamed one name. Just one. We never found out who it belonged to. He died that night in the woods. A nun once embroidered forbidden thoughts into altar cloths. Tiny stitches, barely legible. But if you ran your fingers across them, you could feel the shape of sentences. Her hands felt like forgiveness. My tongue became scripture on her skin. They burned them when they were found, but some sisters pricked their fingers, and kept a thread or two, hidden in sleeves, next to the wrist. There were rituals unspoken, small, quiet things. A candle lit twice in the refectory meant, meet me after compline. A piece of crust left in your bowl meant, I saw your eyes today. A dropped handkerchief by the north gate? That meant, I miss your voice. We had to invent a new language, because the old one punished us. One brother carved initials into the base of his bedpost, not his own. 3 letters, worn smooth over time. I asked him once what they stood for. He just smiled. Said, I used to say his name in prayer. Now I just say it under my breath. The rules didn't stop the feelings. They just made us hide deeper. And the deeper we hid, the stranger it all got. There was one monk who covered his room in scripture. Ceiling to floor, walls, cot, floorboards. He said if he surrounded himself with holiness, he'd be safe. He wasn't. He started scratching at his arms. Said the devil was under his skin, whispering in the voice of someone he once loved. He survived. Barely. They assigned him to the bell tower after that. Alone. We still heard him whispering. The nuns. They got bolder. When letters were forbidden, they sang instead. Songs about flowers and rivers and birds who nested together in the shade. We knew what it meant. Even the priests knew. But no one could prove anything. One priest claimed to receive visions of purity. He described them in detail. Too much detail. One vision involved a dove and a flame, and a sister's breath turning to steam beneath her veil. He was transferred. No one said where. We had guesses. Some monks sculpted. Stone, mostly. One made a statue of a kneeling man, arms outstretched, mouth open. Said it was David in prayer. We thought otherwise. It was removed by morning, but not before someone left a rose in its hand. One nun carved a heart into the back of her chapel seat. Inside it, 3 dots. She said it meant, still here. Still hers. Still hidden. You see it now, don't you? Loneliness didn't make us holy. It made us inventive. Not every story ends in punishment. Some just faded. The longing stayed, but the acts stopped, or at least became smaller. Quieter. A touch passed off as a mistake, a glance too brief to be blamed. But some stories? They ended in fire, or silence, or names erased from the rolls. People who never existed, whose beds were given to someone new, as if nothing ever happened. But something always happened, and some of us remembered. There was a girl they called Sparrow. She came to the convent when she was 12. By 14, she was carving verses into the walls. By 15, they made her stop speaking. Not officially. They just stopped answering her. Silence is a clever kind of violence. One of her carvings read, "The holiest thing I've ever felt was her breath on my neck." Another, "If God is love, and I loved her, who lied to us?" They filled the carvings with plaster, but she just started carving underneath the floorboards. That's where I found them, years later. 36 verses. Every one a wound. There was a monk who fell in love with music. Not someone. Not even a song. Just the sound of beauty. He said it made him feel like he could escape his own skin. But they said music led to vanity, to emotion, to lust. So they made him stop. He broke his own fingers. Said if he couldn't play purely, he wouldn't play at all. He never healed properly. But he hummed. Always hummed. I remember a sister who memorized poems by heart, not to recite, to carry. She said memory was the only hiding place the church couldn't search. Sometimes it wasn't even love or lust we wanted. Sometimes just softness. Someone to hold our grief without quoting scripture. Someone to sit next to us in silence without judging the shape of our silence. Someone to say, You are not wrong for feeling this. That alone would have saved most of us. But it was never offered. So we looked for it in shadows. I once knew 2 monks who shared a pillow for 5 years. They said it was to save space. But their eyes told a different story. One day, one of them was reassigned to a different wing. He didn't argue, just wept, and didn't speak again for months. Sister Dalen said once, "My greatest sin was needing someone, not touching, not loving, needing." That's what terrified them, because a person who needs another cannot be fully controlled. That's what it was always about, control. Sin was just a leash, forgiveness, a collar. They didn't want saints, they wanted servants, ones who blamed themselves for every warmth. Do you know what desire turns into when it's denied too long? Not purity. Obsession. One monk used to smell the robes of others after they bathed, just to remember what life outside prayer smelled like. Another hoarded scraps of linen, ones that had touched skin. He kept them beneath his mattress and prayed over them. The weirder it got, the more rules they added. No humming while cleaning, no washing feet alone, no speaking after compline, even in emergencies, no laughter unless it was about scripture. I broke everyone, on purpose, because obedience without joy isn't virtue, it's surrender. You think this is about sex? It's not. It never was. It's about the war between body and control. Desire just happened to be the battleground. And some of us, we stopped fighting. We made peace with wanting. We let it in, quietly, carefully, like contraband tucked beneath a robe. And we survived. That's the miracle, not the holiness, not the vows. Survival, with softness still intact. There was an old monk named Bren, eyes like rusted nails, voice like gravel soaked in wine. He'd seen it all. One day, he said to me, "You can only beat a heart so many times before it forgets how to be tender." I asked him what he meant. He said, "I've seen men kneel not out of reverence, but to beg their own skin to stop remembering." Some monks wore ropes around their waists, so tight they left bruises. Some tied thorns to their thighs before prayer. Some bit the inside of their cheeks until blood ran between verses. All of them trying to kill something that wasn't wrong to begin with. One night, I stood beneath the stars. No prayers, no shame, just cold air and breath. And I asked aloud, if the soul is so fragile, it must be defended from every touch. What kind of God made it? No one answered, but I heard a voice in the wind that sounded like, "You already know." And I did. Because the God they taught me to fear, he shrank with every rule. But the one I found on my own, he looked a lot like the people I wasn't supposed to love. The nuns never stopped hoping, even when they weren't allowed to speak of it. They grew vines across the back garden wall, wild, defiant. They carved initials into the underside of chapel benches. They left letters inside the sleeves of folded linens. Some never got read. Some got found too late. Some changed everything. There was a priest who tried to shame Sister Alira for smiling during morning prayer. He said, "There is no joy in penance." She replied, "Then your God is too small." She wasn't punished, because no one could figure out how. There was a monk who sang lullabies to himself in an empty cellar. Softly, off-key, beautiful. He said it helped keep his mind from burning up. He said it reminded him of his mother's voice. They told him to stop. He didn't. He died humming. They say silence is golden. But in those walls, it was lead, heavy, poisonous, and impossible to carry alone. I remember the first time someone held my hand in full daylight. No fear, no excuse, no veil of prayer, just fingers in fingers. It was like the first warm breeze of spring after years of snow. I cried. So did he. We never spoke about it again. But it saved me. We weren't saints. We weren't devils. We were just people, hungry for softness, starving for kindness, begging not to be erased by rules that feared what made us human. They told us the body was dangerous. I say, the body was the first language of truth. Before scripture. Before confession. A hand reaching for another in the dark. That's the first gospel. So if you ever wonder, what did monks feel? What did nuns long for? What weird things did we whisper into the night? The answer is simple. Everything. We felt everything. And that's why we were punished. But some of us, we didn't break. We bent. We twisted. We grew in the cracks. And we remembered. I'm still remembering now. Not because I want pity, but because you should know. What they called sin was just love, waiting for permission. You think shame lives in your heart? You're wrong. In the Middle Ages, shame had an address, right in the center of town. It wore wood and rope and blood and spit, and a nameplate so everyone knew exactly what you'd done. There was no hiding, not when you were locked into it. The pillory. 2 thick wooden boards, one above, one below. Your neck in the middle, hands trapped, shoulders burning, knees buckling. They said it was justice. It was theater. And you were the show. I watched a boy in it once, 16, too soft, too pretty. His crime? He kissed another boy behind the chapel. They branded his shoulder with the letter L, said it stood for lecher. We all knew it stood for love. He stood in the pillory for 2 hours. They threw bread, then stones, then names. Not his. Names meant to cut. Beast. Sodom. Devil's pet. Soft boy. One man spat on him and said, "I'll see you in hell and I'll kiss you there myself." They made us watch. Said it was a lesson. It was. But not the one they meant. I learned that day that shame was a performance, and pain was a language. And silence? That was survival. There were other punishments, of course. Some quieter, some crueler. Some designed for humiliation so specific it almost felt personal. There was the scold's bridle, a metal cage fitted over the head, with a bit that went inside the mouth, iron, rough, sometimes spiked, to stop women from speaking. Too loud? Too clever? Too sexual? That's all it took. They'd call her a whore in the morning, strap the bridle on by noon, parade her through the square by dusk. I saw one woman in it once, blood at the corners of her lips, eyes not angry, not afraid, just gone. Like her mind had stepped outside for air. She walked past a group of boys. One of them laughed. She didn't flinch. She just kept walking. And for that moment, she was the strongest person I'd ever seen. You think branding is just a mark? No, it's a sentence. They used hot irons for the worst sins of the flesh. A letter for each offense. F for fornicator. A for adulteress. M for masturbator. I saw that one once. Burned onto the thigh of a monk who wept through the whole thing. Not from the pain, from the fact that they chose his thigh. Close enough to shame him. Far enough he couldn't hide it under robes. Sometimes they'd bind garlic to the face of the condemned. Why garlic? They said it stung the eyes, kept demons away, and made it harder for anyone to kiss you. They called it the cleansing herb. We called it the kiss killer. One man was forced to wear it for 7 days, wrapped tight, tied behind his head. He couldn't eat without crying. They said it cured his lust. But 3 weeks later, he was caught again. This time with someone wearing garlic, too. We laughed. Quietly. But we laughed. Because even shame wasn't strong enough to kill desire. It just gave it new costumes. They made some wear animal masks, goat heads, dog muzzles, pig snouts. Said it represented what they'd become. Bestial, dirty, driven by appetite. But the only beasts I saw were in the crowd, cheering, mocking, throwing rotten onions at people who dared feel. One nun was paraded in a sheep mask, chained at the ankles. Her sin? They said she kissed another sister too slowly, too delicately, as if love could be measured by time. I followed that procession, not because I agreed, because I wanted her to see one face that didn't look away. She didn't cry. She just stared forward. And I swear, under that mask, she smiled. We had a priest once who liked watching these things too much. He stood close, took notes, wrote spiritual observations while people bled in the stocks. I read one of his notes once. The boy shook as the crowd named his lust, a holy tremble. Perhaps the shame has sanctified him. No, it hadn't. It had broken him. He hung himself 3 days later with his own belt. They made a sermon about it, said it was a lesson. It was, just not the one they thought. Want to know the strangest punishment I ever saw? They made a man marry a corpse. Yes, a real one. Not a rotting body, not quite, but lifeless. Still, they said he had loved her in secret, touched her before she died of fever, that his sin had stained her soul. So they forced a ceremony, white linen draped over a bench, him on his knees, vows recited in trembling Latin, a kiss to the cloth, then silence, then exile. They called it purification. We called it cruelty. Not all punishments were public. Some were done behind locked doors. Private shame, personal agony. There was a nun caught carving poetry about another sister. The lines weren't obscene. They were gentle, soft. Lines like, "She smelled like lavender and old rain." But they still punished her. They shaved her head, locked her in a dry cellar, took her voice by forcing silence. 3 months, no speech, no visitors, no sunlight. When she came out, she only spoke in rhyme, like her mind had made a new home and refused to come back. Sometimes, the punishment wasn't from the church, it was from the people. A man once confessed his love for another man, not lust, love. He was cast out. Not by the priests, they were indifferent. But the villagers, they threw his belongings into the mud, poured milk into his bed straw, chained his dog to the mill, and left it there. The dog starved before he could free it. That broke him more than anything else. He left without speaking a word. But before he vanished, he scratched into the chapel door. I loved once, and that was enough. Sometimes they punished you with waiting, postponed confession, weeks without forgiveness, a punishment so quiet it could crush you. Because what is sin if no one will listen? We had one brother who begged for penance. Begged. He wanted the whip, the silence, the isolation. They denied him all of it, told him he didn't deserve the chance to repent. So he walked barefoot through the forest for 6 nights. When they found him, his feet were bleeding, his hands covered in verses he'd scratched into bark. They called it madness. I called it poetry. They made some wear signs, around the neck, over the shoulders. I touched myself. I desired another. I thought of her. Sometimes the words were longer than the rope holding them, and the smaller the sin, the bigger the letters. I remember one girl, 16. The sign around her said, "I saw him swim and imagined warmth." That was all. Imagined warmth. They made her stand in the chapel with that sign for 3 days. She didn't cry, not until someone kissed her hand in secret. Then the tears came, but not from shame, from relief. One monk was punished with silence, but not the kind you know. He wasn't gagged. He wasn't locked away. They simply stopped speaking to him. Everyone. For 100 days. He ate in silence, prayed in silence, walked in silence. It was as if he'd died, and no one had told him. They said it was passive penance, a gentle way to correct disobedience. But there's nothing gentle about erasure. He lasted until day 87. Then one morning he screamed, loud, unholy, animal. It echoed down the cloisters, through the sanctuary, into the orchard. Then silence again. He never screamed again. He never spoke again. He became a ghost that still breathed. There was a sister who fell in love with scent, not a person, just the smell of one. She described it as firewood, sweat, and crushed clover. She said it haunted her during prayer, so they punished her with scent deprivation, tied herbs to her sleeves, strong ones, bitter, so everything smelled like vinegar and ash. She stopped eating, said even her food tasted like shame. When she was finally released from the punishment, she said, "I no longer fear desire. I fear never wanting again." That stayed with me. Some punishments were made up on the spot. There was no consistency. That was the point. You couldn't prepare. One monk was made to crawl through the chapel every day for a week, not because of lust, because he complimented another monk's singing voice. They said it was flattery. That flattery leads to pride. That pride leads to the devil. He never sang again, but I did. Louder. For both of us. Some were branded with wax instead of iron, melted, then dripped onto the collarbone or thigh. Said to symbolize temporary sin. The mark faded in days, but the pain lingered. So did the shame. And yet, some resisted. Quietly, they found ways to rewrite the shame. One sister wore her punishment sign upside down, said it was an accident. We knew it wasn't. One brother smiled in the pillory, not a mocking smile, a soft one, like he'd finally been seen, and didn't mind. I remember writing poems in the margins of a punishment ledger. Tiny. So small, no one could see them unless they were looking for them. I was hoping someone would. Someone did. They left a reply, an ink lighter than mine. It said, "Still with you?" Sometimes rebellion isn't loud. It's tender, subtle, patient. We knew the system wouldn't change, but we could survive it. And that, in its own way, was resistance. Sometimes the worst punishments came with smiles. They called them redemptive ceremonies, meant to cleanse the soul, to reintegrate the fallen. But really, they were parades of shame. You'd be made to walk barefoot through the nave, sometimes naked under a sheer robe, sometimes with ashes rubbed into your scalp. The others would sing hymns, not for you, over you, like a funeral you were forced to attend alive. One monk walked that path for indecent dreams. That's all. Dreams. No one touched him. No one kissed him. Just a dream that lingered too long after waking. He walked in silence. No eye contact. Not a single step out of place. But his hands trembled. And when the song ended, he collapsed. The abbot said he was overwhelmed by the spirit. I knew better. He was crushed under the weight of never being allowed to be human. Not all shame was visible. Some was spoken. Whispers passed like knives in cloisters. She's been too quiet lately. Did you see how he looked at Brother Thomas? Why does she always sit beside Sister Morin? He flinched during confession. That means something. You didn't have to be guilty. You just had to be noticed. We learned to fold ourselves smaller, speak less, move less, think less, until the only thing left untouched was the ache. There was one nun who refused to name the person she loved. They tried everything. Isolation, fasting, public confession. Still, she said nothing. She'd only smile and say, "If you knew how kind she was, you'd understand." They never broke her. She died before they could. But they buried her, with her hands clasped around a pressed violet. No one ever found out where it came from. There was a monk who refused penance, said he had nothing to regret. They called it arrogance. He called it truth. They beat him. He bled. They kept beating him. He kept smiling. And when they finally stopped, he whispered, "You only hurt me because you lost to yourself." Then, Ver touched him again, but they made sure he was never seen again either. He disappeared during the next pilgrimage. We remembered, because memory was the only justice we had. We created rituals of our own, secret ones. A soft knock under a bench meant, "You are not alone." A stolen flower pressed into a hymn book meant, "You are still wanted." A shared sip of water after prayer meant, "You're more than what they say." And if someone reached for your hand, ever so slightly, during silent reflection, you let them. You held it back, not in defiance, but in communion. Because in a world built to shame everything warm, every kindness was rebellion. You know what they feared more than lust? Joy. Real joy. The kind that makes people forget they're supposed to hate themselves. That's what they tried to kill. So they punished it. Laughter during prayer? Punishable. Singing that wasn't liturgical? Punishable. Dancing, even alone, in private. You'd be questioned. Watched. Maybe flogged. There was a nun who used to tap rhythms into her knee while she worked. Nothing wild, just little patterns. They called it immodest. Tied her wrists together for a week. She never tapped again. But one day, I saw her walk barefoot in the snow. No flinch, no sound, just calm. As if to say, "You can tie my hands, but my body still belongs to me." That was the real fear, wasn't it? That our bodies might belong to us. Because when you reclaim your body, you stop needing permission. You stop confessing what isn't wrong. You stop letting them write your name next to someone else's sin. Some people cracked. Others vanished. A few adapted. We had a brother who confessed his thoughts before anyone could accuse him. Every morning, he'd list them like groceries. I thought of Brother Cale's lips. I imagined lying in grass with Sister Marga, though I know I never will. I woke from a dream where someone kissed me, gender unclear. But I liked it. They punished him at first, but over time they stopped, because he made sin boring, and that was power. Turned shame into routine, and they lose their weapon. There was another kind of shame they never named. Absence. The shame of not feeling anything, of going numb. Some celebrated purity. But what they really had was emptiness. They didn't love. They didn't ache. They didn't long. They simply endured. I once asked an older monk what he missed most from his youth. He said, "Regret. Because at least it meant I'd wanted something." There was a priest who punished himself every time he failed to feel tempted, because he thought God was testing him. No desire meant no struggle. No struggle meant no holiness. He started inventing fantasies just to have something to reject. We found his journal after he died. Pages and pages of imagined sins, followed by crossed-out prayers. False. Empty. No fire. Try again tomorrow. Desire was dangerous, but the absence of desire? Terrifying, because it meant you'd forgotten how to be alive. They didn't just brand bodies. They branded memory. I still remember every person who looked at me with longing and fear tangled together. Still remember hands that lingered on accident, or maybe not. Still remember whispered apologies for feelings that never harmed anyone. They made us say, sorry for things that made us human. And they did it with robes, and books, and candles, and rules. But what they really used was loneliness. The kind that wraps around your ribs like rope, soft at first, then tighter, then unbearable. There were moments of mercy, rare, small, but real. One nun left a flower on another's pillow, just once. No note, no explanation, but it was enough. Because that night, the second nun stopped crying in her sleep. One monk gave his bread to a younger brother, every day for a week. He said he wasn't hungry. We knew he was. But hunger wasn't just for food. It was for kindness. Those tiny mercies became gospel, unwritten, unrecorded, unspoken, but holy. They never taught us that kind of holiness, the kind that happens in whispers, in glances, in a stolen smile passed across rows of stone and silence, because it doesn't make good scripture, but it makes good memory. And memory is where truth lives. The last punishment I ever saw was the one that finally broke me. A young boy, barely more than a novice, confessed to wanting to be touched. Just wanting. He didn't act, didn't write, didn't speak it aloud until confession. He begged them not to tell, but they made him walk the shame line, naked, holding a sign that said, "I am not strong enough." He walked slowly, carefully, eyes ahead, chin up. But I saw it. His fists clenched tight enough to bleed. Afterward, he was made to sleep in the stable for a month. No warmth, no words, no light. When he returned, he smiled all the time. Too much, too wide. Like he'd found a new mask and glued it on. They said he was healed. I say he was hollowed. That was the day I decided. I would never confess again. Not because I was pure, but because I refused to let anyone else name my feelings as crime. I started writing instead, late at night, by candlelight, on scraps, on bark, on walls hidden behind icons, poems, names, moments I never wanted to forget. They burned, most of them, but some survived. I know because you're still listening. You, yes, you, whoever you are. If you've ever felt shame for something gentle, if you've ever hidden kindness like a secret, if you've ever touched someone and called it sin, then this chapter was written for you. Because the stalks rot, the brands fade, the masks crack, the garlic stinks and dies. But memory resists, and resistance is sacred. They made shame public. We made survival private. They had iron, we had softness. And I still think we won. Because they wrote laws. We wrote each other. They built churches. We built hope. They punished love. But love never needed their permission. That is what I remember. And that is why I speak. Not to accuse, to witness. So if you find yourself someday locked in your own kind of pillory, branded by guilt, staring down a crowd that calls your name like it's an insult, remember this. The shame is not yours. It never was. It belongs to the people who told you to carry it. Drop it. Walk forward. Look up. And if you need to, smile. Even if your knees shake. Because smiling in the face of false shame, that's holy. There's a kind of touch that says everything, even when no one else sees it. A hand brushing wet skin in a crowded bathhouse. A fingertip grazing a sleeve during prayer. A knuckle pressed too long against someone else's palm while pretending to pass a cup. They said we were impure. That temptation was everywhere. But it wasn't temptation. It was loneliness, dressed in linen and candlelight. We were starved for touch, not lust, not even love. Just something real. Proof that we were still human. And in places they never looked, we found it. Let me start with the bathhouses. Yes, those. Not the clean, tiled palaces you might imagine. Ours were wooden, steam-soaked, dim, full of silence and dripping echoes. But in the right moment, with the right person, they became holy. Some went just to be clean. Others went to feel seen. You were naked there, yes, but not exposed, not judged. There was a strange kind of honesty in it, one you couldn't find in confession. I remember sitting across from a monk in the baths. Neither of us spoke, but our knees touched under the water. Neither of us moved away. Not for the full hour. The warmth wasn't just from the steam. It was from being allowed to exist beside another soul without shame. And then there were the confessionals. Different kind of heat. Not the kind you feel on skin. The kind you feel when someone says something they've never said aloud. And they say it to you. The confessional was supposed to be a place of purity, but it was the most intimate room in the entire church. 2 people, a wooden screen, and words no one else would ever hear. It was supposed to be about truth, but it became something else. Something more dangerous, because where else could a man speak his deepest hunger and know he'd be heard? I remember a brother who came every Friday. He never named a soul, just whispered fragments. I watched him pray. I shouldn't have, but I couldn't stop. Her voice makes me forget the words I'm supposed to say. I don't want to stop. That's the worst part. He always cried at the end, not out of guilt, out of relief, because at least someone knew. Confession wasn't always about forgiveness. Sometimes it was the only place desire was allowed to exist, even if only for a moment, even if it had to be wrapped in guilt. And sometimes it wasn't guilt at all. Sometimes people confessed love, soft, trembling, holy love, and asked, "Is that a sin too?" The priests didn't always know how to answer. Some just stayed silent. Some muttered rote phrases. Some tried to make the person feel dirty for wanting to be loved. But others? A few. They listened, really listened. And sometimes, just sometimes, they whispered back, "God is not afraid of that kind of love." That whisper? It saved people, even if they never said it again. Let's go back to the bathhouses, because that's where things got real. That's where shame met steam, and didn't know how to fight it. People watched each other differently there. No sin in a glance. Not when everyone's bare. But it wasn't about the bodies. It was about attention. Undivided. Quiet. Intimate. There was a sister who sat with her knees pulled to her chest in the corner. Every time another woman passed, she'd look down. Too fast. Too hard. One day, someone sat beside her. Didn't speak. Just sat. Their arms touched. Thighs met. Shoulders leaned. And nothing happened. But everything changed. They left together that day. Still silent. But somehow, seen. Do you understand now? Touch doesn't have to be physical. Sometimes it's 2 people daring to be still beside each other, in a world that teaches them to run. There was a rule. No touching outside of holy ceremony. But rules like that only made touch more powerful, more loaded, more electric. So we made our own kinds of ceremony. Secret ones. A brush of the back of the hand during shared prayer. A finger passed over the lip of a shared chalice. A shoulder leaned against a shoulder, not by accident, but left there. We became masters of pretending not to touch, while touching more deeply than anyone knew. One brother sat beside me every morning for 3 years. He always reached for the same hymn book, held it close enough that our fingers met, page after page. Never said a word, never looked over. But I memorized every callus on his knuckles, every tiny tremor in his pinky. The hymn book outlasted him. But the memory of those hands? Still here. The church feared lust, but what they feared more was affection. Because affection can't be punished as easily. You can call sex a sin. But how do you punish tenderness? How do you condemn someone for missing someone? They tried. They always tried. but affection slipped through, like mist through stone. Let me tell you about the girl they called the Lantern. Her name was Mir, but people started calling her that because of the way she made others feel, like warmth in the cold. She never touched anyone improperly, never said anything bold, just listened, with her whole face, with her whole soul, and people fell in love with that. With being seen. The priests took notice, called her a source of distraction. They moved her 3 times, different convents, different towns, but people kept finding her, and she kept lighting them up. They finally silenced her. Vow of perpetual silence, claimed she chose it. We knew better. But years later, I met someone who knew her. Said she still smiled when others spoke, still listened with fire in her eyes, still held space like it was a prayer. They couldn't take that from her, because touch isn't just hands, it's presence. It's being willing to witness someone's pain without trying to fix it. And that terrified them, because people who feel seen, they stop obeying out of fear. They start obeying out of love. Or not at all. Let me tell you another story. One that still aches. There was a boy named Kale. Too bright, too kind, too open. He loved everyone. Genuinely, platonically, romantically, spiritually. He believed every soul deserved to be adored. He'd sit beside you during meals and ask, "Have you been hugged lately?" No one ever answered, but he'd hug them anyway. Quick, gentle, honest. The first few times, people laughed. By the 10th time, they wept. He was warned, told his behavior was too familiar. He said, "Familiarity is the beginning of trust. Trust is the beginning of peace." They called that heresy. He was sent away. Some said to a monastery in the north. Others said deeper. Worse. Colder. I never saw him again. But I still remember that last hug. His chin rested on my shoulder, like he was saying goodbye. Maybe he was. Some people touched without ever touching. There was a sister named Dalun. She wrote psalms, but hid meaning inside them. Not the obvious ones. The hidden lines. Acrostics. Symbols. Half phrases you could only hear if you were listening differently. One verse went, "Deliver me not from longing, for it was you who placed it there." That line never made it into the official hymnal. They burned that page. She smiled when they did, because someone had already copied it and carried it in their sleeve. That's how we survived. Through fragments, glances, touches made of ink and intention. There was a monk who couldn't bear to speak his love, so he carved it. Tiny notches into his prayer beads. Each one stood for a name, a moment, a heartbeat. He held them every morning, ran his thumb over them. No one ever knew what they meant. But I did. Because once, when he thought I was asleep, he pressed one bead against my hand and breathed out, not a word, not a sound, but a truth so heavy it made me shiver. He never touched me again. He didn't need to. That one moment fed me for years. Touch became language, and language became refuge. We invented new rituals, because the old ones had too much fear baked into them. We had the shared candle. One taper passed between hands in silence. No flame, just wax warmed by palm heat. It meant, I see you. I hold your story. I don't need it explained. We had the folded cloth, 2 pieces of linen left on a bench. If one was moved, it meant, wait for me. If both were gone, it meant, I waited, but couldn't stay. I still remember you, and the sleeve knot, a loose tie at the wrist. If you noticed it, and re-knotted it tighter while walking past, it meant, I understand, and I'm still here. None of this was written down. None of it could be punished, because it wasn't official, but it was our eel, more real than anything we ever read in the book. We didn't need miracles. We needed meaning. And sometimes meaning lived in silence, not scripture. People think medieval life was harsh because of the hunger, the wars, the cold. That was just background noise. The real harshness was the war against tenderness. They beat the body, not just with whips, but with shame. They trained us to fear our own fingertips, our own breath, our own closeness. But what they didn't count on was how deeply we needed each other. We weren't fools. We knew the risks. Every glance could be misread, every kindness misjudged, every moment of softness recast as sin. But we did it anyway, because the alternative was to live untouched, unseen, unloved. And that, to many of us, felt worse than hell. I knew a monk named Jonan. He never looked you in the eye, not out of fear, but to protect you. He said his face gave too much away. I believed him, because once he looked at me, just once, and I felt like he'd read every thought I'd tried to bury. He never spoke of affection, never broke a rule. But when I broke down in the candle storeroom one evening, grief too sharp, silence too loud, he sat beside me. He didn't touch me, just placed his palm on the floor beside mine, not touching, just next to. Close enough to feel, far enough not to damn either of us. That's how people loved in those days, not in grand declarations, but in micro-defiance. We had to smuggle affection into daily life. A shared sip of soup, a brush of a sleeve during vestment folding, a pause while handing over a scroll, one heartbeat longer than necessary. And sometimes we broke the rules. We risked it. There were bathhouse nights, late ones, when we lingered too long, waited until the steam curled soft and private, until the doors clicked shut. There were touches that asked permission with a glance and answered with a breath. Nothing loud, nothing urgent, just presence. Shared, agreed upon, holy in its quiet rebellion. We never spoke of those moments afterward, not out of shame, but because silence kept them intact. Words might crack the memory, so we let it live untouched. One nun said it best. The things I remember clearest are the ones I never said aloud. We wrote nothing down. We left no trace. Because in that world, to be known was to be hunted. But we kept remembering. That's what saved us. Sometimes we wrote in riddles. Her laughter was a storm that washed the chapel clean. He walked like forgiveness. I broke my fast on the shape of her shadow. They didn't understand what we meant, but we did. Because in a world of locked doors, meaning became a kind of escape. We made maps of memory, not drawn, lived. Each touch, a landmark. Each glance, a compass. Each whisper, a direction home. One winter, the bathhouse froze. Pipes cracked. Steam turned to frost. No one went in for weeks. You'd think that would stop us. But it didn't. We started gathering in the Andre's cellar instead. Still warm from boiled linens. Still quiet. Still sacred. We called it the second sanctuary. It smelled of soap and skin and silence. And every now and then, if the door was left open just enough, you could hear someone laugh. Soft. Quick. Almost like they forgot where they were. But we never laughed too long. We knew what joy cost. One boy folded sheets beside me. Didn't speak, didn't look. But he whistled. A soft tune I didn't recognize. Each note felt like a touch. Each breath like a confession with no guilt. I never asked what song it was, because I was afraid it would lose its magic if I knew the words. There were other moments like that. Moments too fragile to describe. A hand left resting on a wooden beam. An echo of someone's prayer that sounded just like your name. A cloth shared on a cold stone bench, even if it meant one person shivered a little more. We weren't starved for flesh. We were starved for mercy. And we found it in small ways. Stolen, smuggled, whispered mercy. A nun once kissed another's bandaged hand. Nothing erotic, just reverent. Like a vow. A monk once tied a string around another's finger, not to mark sin, but to remember something good. A night. A word. A moment too kind to forget. These were not sins. They were psalms. Unwritten, but sung in the silence between bells. The church could take our hours, could take our names, could take our sleep, our hair, our confessions. But not those memories, not those touches, because we'd already buried them inside ourselves, too deep to be dug up, too sacred to be shamed. Do you know what the word confess really means? It means to speak together, not to grovel, not to suffer, to speak together. And that's what we did, in baths, in cellars, in folded cloth and knotted sleeves. We spoke together, with bodies, with breath, with being. There was a priest who used to say, "All fire burns, even the sacred kind." He meant it as a warning, but I took it as a reminder. Some fires are worth the burn, like the fire of a stolen moment. The fire of someone brushing your back with wet hair in the bathhouse, not by accident, but as a gift. The fire of kneeling next to someone in prayer and feeling your breath sink without trying. They said we were tempted, but they never understood. We weren't looking for sin. We were looking for evidence that someone else in that building full of silence felt what we did. And when we found it, in a glance, in a phrase, in a pause between chants, we held on to it like light in winter. I remember a sister who stitched messages into altar cloths, not words, shapes, tiny coded symbols in thread. A triangle with a line through it meant, "I remember you." A circle stitched in blue meant, "Your softness is safe with me." A square in lavender thread meant, "I dreamed of you last night, and you smiled." They made her stop once they found out, but someone kept adding those stitches anyway, which means someone else learned her language and kept it alive. That's how it always worked. Love found a way, not loudly, not perfectly, but faithfully. There were times I thought I was alone, in my longing, in my ache, in my need to be held and not erased. But then someone would reach out, not literally, just enough. Enough to say, "Me too." That was enough, most of the time. I once sat across from a brother who was being punished. He wasn't allowed to speak, had to eat with his hands tied behind his back. The bowl was placed on the ground. He had to kneel. Like a dog. I couldn't bear it. So I took his bowl, placed it on the table between us, untied his hands, said nothing, just nodded once, then left. He never thanked me. He didn't have to. But later, I found my prayer robe folded on my cot, cleaner than I'd left it, with a lavender stitch in the corner. A single square. I knew what it meant. Forgiveness never moved me like that moment did. Some touches leave marks you can't see. They linger not on skin, but behind the eyes. They show up years later, in the way your hands shake when you think of someone's laugh, in the way your breath slows when you hear a hymn in the right key. I remember one, clear as winter air. It was during Lent. Silence. Cold. Nothing but roots and dry bread for days. But I couldn't stop thinking about him. The way he knelt beside me. The way he smelled like rain caught in linen. The way he looked at me like I was something he had already forgiven. One night, he pressed his forehead to mine. That's all. Nothing more. No kiss. No vow. Just his skin touching mine, like we were matching the shape of sorrow. And I knew. That's what we were all really aching for. Not to be saved, to be matched. matched in our hunger, matched in our confusion, matched in our love that had nowhere to go except back into ourselves. The church feared that kind of love because it had no rules. It didn't kneel when told. It didn't confess when untouched. It didn't sin just because it existed. It was free. We weren't free, but that love was. And sometimes we got to borrow it, just for a breath. We turned that breath into scripture, a scripture no one could burn, because it was written into us. There's something about the quiet of a confessional, or the haze of a steam room, or the hush of evening prayers. That makes people honest. It strips away pride. It leaves only what matters. I miss her. I thought about him again. I just want to be touched without flinching. I don't want to die without having felt safe. They called that sin. I call it survival. We learn to survive on crumbs of affection, a soft word, a meal shared slowly, a hymn hummed off-key together in the dark, and we made it work. We made it holy. Because if they wouldn't let us build altars for that kind of love, then we became the altars. There were stories we told each other, quiet ones, not written in books, not shared in sermons, just passed, person to person, like fire, hidden in cloth. One was about a monk and a knight. They met during confession. The knight came with blood still on his hands, battle-born, broken. He didn't confess sin. He confessed numbness, said he couldn't feel anything anymore. Not fear, not joy, not grief. The monk listened, not just with ears, with everything. And when the knight paused, too tired to cry, the monk said, "Would you let me touch your hand?" The knight did, just once, just a single brush of palm to palm. And then the knight wept, because finally, something felt real. That was the whole story. No kiss, no scandal, no shame. Just two people. And a touch that pulled one of them back to life. That story stayed with me, because that's what most of us wanted. Not permission to sin, permission to feel without punishment, to ache without exile, to be seen and still be welcome. That's what bathhouses were for. That's what confessionals became. That's what sleep hall whispers carried when no one else was listening. We learned to survive through ritual, but we learned to live through one another. And even now, even after the buildings have crumbled, even after the books have faded, even after the punishments are just memories, the touches remain. I can still feel them. A hand on mine during prayer, a sleeve that lingered, a robe that smelled like someone I wasn't supposed to remember, a mouth that never kissed me, but shaped its silence around my name. They taught us to forget those things. We didn't, because that's how we outlived the shame, not with rebellion, but with memory. They built walls. We built stories. They wrote rules. We wrote each other into one another. And now you're here, listening, which means you remember too, even if no one taught you, even if no one ever told you how. You already know, because everyone carries a touch they were never allowed to name. And when you say it aloud, even in a whisper, even in a dream, that's not sin. That's return. That's coming back to the place you were always meant to be, where kindness is not shameful, where longing is not crime, where love does not need forgiveness, and where the body is not the enemy, but the first language of the soul. The bed was never just a bed, not in the convent, not in the monastery, not in the quiet stone corners of belief. It was altar. It was battlefield. It was courtroom and cage. They told us sleep was sacred, but they never trusted what we did in the dark, because at night, things softened. The rules bent. The silence changed shape. You heard someone crying and didn't pretend you didn't. You reached for a hand under the wool, and didn't always stop yourself. You dreamed of someone, and woke up aching. Beds were where the soul whispered louder than scripture, and that terrified them. Let me tell you about the first night I slept beside someone, not touching, just near. His name was Lior. He breathed like the sea, rough on the inhale, gentle on the out. The first few nights I stayed perfectly still, blanket pulled high, eyes wide. But then, one night, his knee bumped mine. Accidentally. Maybe. And neither of us moved. We lay like that for hours, just 2 points of warmth, tethered in silence. And I learned something. You can fall in love without ever seeing someone's face in the light. They didn't monitor the dormitories during storms. Too dark, too cold, too loud with wind and dripping roofs. So we learned to move then. Hands reached out in thunder, breath mingled during rain, because punishment waited in daylight. But nighttime, that was mercy's hour. There was one storm when I woke up with his back against mine. Lior, warm, barely touching. But the heat between us felt like a vow. I didn't dare turn. But I didn't pull away either. Because in that moment, I wasn't a monk. I wasn't a sinner. I wasn't afraid. I was simply with him. They never talked about what beds did to the body, how linen clings to skin, how silence amplifies breath, how softness becomes unbearable when you've gone too long without it. I remember one brother, Thomas. He whispered confessions at night, not into ears, into the mattress, like the straw could carry his shame better than God could. I dreamed of her again. I miss what I've never touched. I woke up with tears on my chest, and I don't know why. The bed absorbed it all, never judged, just held him. I started doing it too, whispering into wool, because sometimes you don't need to be answered, just heard. We didn't need absolution. We needed arms. They said sleeping alone kept us pure, but all it did was keep us lonely. And loneliness? That's where sin festers, not in closeness, but in isolation. We learned to inch closer over weeks, not sudden, not spoken, just a shift here, a breath there, until your back met someone else's spine and didn't move. That kind of closeness. It rewired the soul. It told you, you are real. You are here. You are not disgusting. They feared that, because once someone feels lovable, they stop being controllable. Beds were supposed to be for sleep, but we knew better. They were for breathing without judgment, for holding warmth a little longer than needed, for whispering names into the dark because daylight didn't allow it. There was a nun. Her name was Leon. She was always silent during the day, proper, buttoned, unshakable. But at night, she sang soft songs, songs in no known language, just humming, vowels, sound. She'd face the wall and let it out like prayer. No one ever punished her, because to punish that, they'd have to admit they heard it. I shared a room with 3 others for 6 years. No one spoke about touch, but it happened. A hand offered after a nightmare, a thigh pressed close during winter, a palm rested between shoulder blades when someone broke silently. No words, just presence. Because presence heals what confession can't reach. They told us the devil comes at night. They were right. But not the way they meant. The devil came in the form of silence made sharp, the kind that told you your hunger made you wrong, that your warmth belonged to no one, not even you. I remember waking one night to someone crying across the room. Not loud, just small, contained. That kind of cry that comes from someone trying not to need. I crossed the floor, didn't ask, didn't touch, just lay down near enough for him to feel I was there. His breathing slowed, and that was the holiest thing I ever witnessed. Beds don't judge. People do. That's why the best love I ever felt happened under blankets, not behind altars. We invented new kinds of vows, not with words, with rhythm. If someone exhaled after you, matched your breath, it meant, I'm listening. If their knee rested against yours without tension, it meant, I trust you. If they let their heel touch yours during a dream, that was a miracle. Because dreams told the truth. And beds, they caught the pieces. There was one bed in the western dormitory, lower bunk, back wall, third from the left. We called it the mercy bed, because anyone could sleep there as long as they needed to. No one asked questions. No one claimed it. It belonged to whoever had run out of strength that day. Some lay there when grief was too sharp. Others, when touch had been taken from them too long. I spent 3 nights in that bed. Once after a beating. Once after a goodbye. Once after I dreamed of Leor and woke up sobbing. Every time I found something tucked under the pillow. A note, a ribbon. Once, a sprig of dried rosemary. Not signed, not explained. Just someone saying, you matter. That's what we made the beds into. Not temptation, not corruption. Refuge. They feared what we might do in private, but they should have feared what we built there, because we didn't just rest. We remembered. We healed. We whispered the truth to each other in a world that only shouted lies. I remember waking up once to someone tracing my spine, not in lust, not in boldness, just tracing. Like reading, like reminding me I was made of something worth touching. We never spoke of it. He never did it again. But I slept without shame for a week after that. Sometimes, healing only needs a moment. One monk wrote dreams down on the beams above his bed. Tiny chalk marks. No names, just the outlines. The river again. She had her hair down. Warmth, hands, no fear. He erased them each morning, but I read them first, because we all dreamt similar dreams. And when I saw mine on his beam, I knew I wasn't broken. I was just alone. Until I wasn't. They said love belonged in daylight, in rules, in rows, in recitations. But love came to us in the dark, not to tempt, to stay. There was a night I couldn't breathe, not from sickness, from memory. A face I hadn't seen in years came to me in a dream, smiling, then vanishing. And when I woke, it felt like I'd lost him all over again. I didn't cry, didn't move, just stared into the black and it waited for the ache to pass. It didn't, but someone else did. He must have heard something in my silence. He sat at the edge of my bed, didn't touch, didn't speak, just stayed. His presence said everything words couldn't. You are not alone with this. Later, I left him half my bread. No explanation. But the next night, he came back. Same time, same place, same quiet. That was love, too. They had no word for that kind of devotion. So they called it impurity. Because what they couldn't control, they tried to shame. But we didn't need names. We had patterns, breaths, the way someone reached for your shoulder in sleep and didn't pull away. There was one sister who carved initials into the frame of her bed. 3 sets. Never explained. But every year, on the same night, she sat on the floor beside them, lit a small candle, and wept quietly. A vigil for love that could never be named, but never left. Beds held more than bodies. They held stories. I once found a note tucked beneath my mattress. It read, "You are still good, even when they say you are not." No signature. But I knew the handwriting, and I folded that paper into my robe, kept it close, even after the ink faded, because sometimes the body forgets, but the soul never does. They made us fear touch, so we turned to sound. A sigh in the dark meant, I'm still awake. A hum meant, you're not alone. A soft cough followed by silence meant, please don't speak, but stay. We created lullabies without melody, songs of presence, notes written in breath. I remember one boy, not even 15, whispering prayers that didn't exist, not from scripture, from longing. Blessed be the ones who wake alone and still rise. Blessed be the ones who touch no one, but still burn with kindness. Blessed be the quiet ones who hide their names in other people's safety. We said amen anyway. Beds gave us a place to believe in things they didn't teach us, like softness, like shared silence, like love that didn't need permission. The church feared bedrooms more than brothels, because in bedrooms, people remembered who they were. They remembered that a warm shoulder could save a life, that a breath beside yours could make your grief quiet for a few hours, that not all fire comes to destroy. Some fire just wants to warm. There was a brother named Ethan. He'd twitch in his sleep every night, small flinches. We didn't know why, until one night he shouted a name and cried. I got out of bed and touched his hand. Just one touch. He calmed instantly, fell back asleep. After that, we slept near. Not beside, just near. Close enough that if one of us fell, the other would know. He never spoke about it. I never asked. But he started breathing deeper, and I started waking up without dread. And neither of us needed to be saved anymore, because we'd found each other in the dark. Some nights we didn't sleep at all, not because of fear, because the night felt too sacred to waste. We'd lie still, side by side, breathing, not touching, not always, but matching each other's rhythm, letting time pass without needing to fill it. That was its own kind of prayer. There was a man named Bastian who used to speak in his sleep, not always clearly, but certain names returned, certain phrases. Don't leave yet. Just 5 more minutes. You're safe now. No one mocked him, because we all had words we wanted to say in the dark, but were too afraid to speak while awake. Beds were not sinful. The sin was in pretending we didn't need each other. There was once a girl who sang into her blanket every night. No tune, no lyrics, just hums and air. She said it helped her remember her mother's voice, that she was terrified of forgetting softness. I understand that now, more than ever, because it's not lust we remember, it's gentleness. That's what survives. The slow thumb circling your wrist when the world feels too heavy. The hum against your spine when someone breathes too close. The hand that steadies yours under the covers, even when no one's watching. They said our beds would turn us wicked. But really, they turned us brave, because it takes courage to be vulnerable in a world that punishes closeness. It takes defiance to rest your head near someone else's heartbeat and not pull away. They feared what we might do in those beds. But what we did was survive, together. The loneliest people weren't the ones without beds. They were the ones who never let anyone close, even when they wanted to. I knew a man who always slept facing the wall, even when the room was warm, even when others shifted closer. One night, I asked him why, and he said, "If I turn around, I might need something I'm not allowed to ask for." I never forgot that, because that's what we were taught. Don't need, don't want, don't reach. But our bodies betrayed us. They curled toward warmth. They leaned into comfort. They dreamed of softness, even when our minds had been trained to reject it. We were taught to discipline the flesh. But the flesh, gentle, loyal, desperate to be loved, kept asking for mercy. Sometimes we gave it. Quietly. Without ceremony. I once kissed someone's hand while they were asleep, just once. Not out of desire, out of gratitude. Because that hand had steadied me when I almost collapsed during a fast. Because it had passed me bread without judgment. Because it had once, just once, squeezed mine when I was trembling. They never knew I did it, and I never told them. But I remember how their fingers twitched, just slightly, as if saying, "I forgive you," even if I don't know why. We didn't always get permission to love, but we found ways anyway. They gave us hard floors, narrow cots, straw pillows. We turned them into altars. They gave us silence. We turned it into lullabies. They gave us shame. We turned it into memory. They tried to keep us pure, but they forgot. We were already sacred, not because of what we resisted, but because of how we cared. We cared in whispers, in held breath, in hands rested near, not on, in eyes that stayed open just long enough to say, "I'm here." And in beds, straw-filled, narrow, cold, we became more than survivors. We became witnesses. We saw each other. Really saw. Without masks, without robes, without titles. Just breath, and skin, and need. There was a night I remember more clearly than any sermon. Storm outside, fire low, half the dorm asleep. And beside me, a boy I barely knew. But his hand was trembling in the dark, so I took it. No questions. No vows. Just held it. And he held back. That was it. That was enough. In a world that punished closeness, we still reached. In a system that branded longing as weakness, we still longed. And in beds meant for silence, we built something loud enough to echo across centuries. Love is not the enemy. Let them write their scriptures. We had stories. Let them lock their doors. We had dreams. Let them fear the night. We lived there, not as sinners, as saints of softness, disciples of warmth, bearers of unspoken hope. So now, when you lie in your own bed and you remember someone, their voice, their hand, the feeling of being seen even once, don't call it shame. Call it sacred. Call it what we did. Salvation without permission. They always said the body was the enemy. But when they needed someone to punish, when they needed a place to write their laws, when they needed a canvas for shame, they used the body. Flesh remembers. Scars don't fade. And some stories, they were carved into skin. We'll begin this chapter in a cell, one barely wider than the reach of your arms, with the sound of breathing too loud in the dark. We'll start with the story of a woman whose crime was touching joyfully, and a boy whose punishment was to be looked at like desire itself was a disease. But first, let me tell you what happened in the square when someone was caught loving wrong. The square was made for spectacle. Raised platform, wooden block, chains that clinked even when no one moved. Punishment wasn't about pain, it was about memory. You were meant to remember the shame, the silence, the eyes. That's what made it stick. There was a girl, barely grown, who smiled at the wrong person. That's all it took. One smile, too long, too bold, too happy. She was taken the next morning, stripped of her sleeves. That was how they showed you had committed acts of flesh. They bound her wrists and paraded her before the chapel. She did not cry. She did not speak. But she did not bow her head. And that scared them more than her crime ever did. They locked her in the penitent's room. Stone floor, no blanket, a window too small for sky. She stayed there 6 days. When she emerged, she walked like she'd left something behind. And maybe she had. Maybe that's what punishment was for. Not to correct. To remove. To erase. But not all pain erases. Some pain becomes story. Some pain becomes seed. We began planting those seeds where no one could see. In looks passed during penance. In fingers slipped through slats of cell doors, in the chalk marks left on the wall before the sun came up. I knew a man who was punished for public affection. He'd kissed his lover goodbye before leaving for the North Road. Just once. Soft. Forgettable to anyone else, but not to the priest who saw it. They whipped him for it. 3 lashes across the back. But you know what stayed? The way his lover kissed the wounds afterward, gently, like each one was holy. They called that blasphemy. I call it mercy. The church kept a book, not the good one, a different one, hidden, leather-bound, padlocked, smelled like wax and damp ink. It held names, dates, crimes, but not murder, not theft. No, these were bodily crimes. Illicit contact between novices, improper embrace during morning prayers, mutual stimulation between penitents, use of eyes to express lust. Yes, eyes. They recorded how long a glance lasted, how close knees came to touching, if laughter sounded too full. It wasn't about the act, it was about the threat. Because a kiss was never just a kiss. A kiss was a crack in the wall, a way in, a rebellion written in skin. There was a couple, 2 monks, both older. They'd served quietly for years. No whispers, no defiance, just closeness. Too much of it. One day, someone noticed how they always chose the same pew, how their robes brushed too often, how one always waited at the basin for the other. They were summoned, questioned, separated. Neither broke, neither admitted, neither begged. So they were both punished equally. Silence for 1 year. No speech, no writing, no names, not even to themselves. One of them didn't make it. Stopped eating by month 3. The other, I'll never forget, carried a candle to his grave and whispered something into the dirt. We never found out what. But he returned to the chapel every night after. Lit a candle. Just one. Even after they forbade it. Even after they locked the box. We kept finding lit candles anyway. Because you can't ban remembrance. You can't punish love and expect it to forget. The punishment wasn't always physical. Sometimes it was removal. You'd wake up, and someone's cot would be empty. Gone. No goodbye. No explanation. Just air. We learned to read absence like scripture. If the blanket was folded, they'd gone willingly. If it was left in a heap, they'd been taken. We held those shapes in our minds for weeks, mourning in silence, because to speak of it was to invite it. One of the cruelest punishments? The bench. Simple. Wooden. Hard. Set just outside the refectory. You sat there at mealtimes, alone, facing the wall. You were fed last. You could not speak. Could not look. Could not be looked at. For 1 hour, every day, for weeks. Sometimes months. No blood. No bruises. Just vanishing. I remember when Leon was sent there. No one said why. She'd smiled too often, maybe. Laughed once in the bathhouse, Hay said. She didn't cry, didn't bow, but she stopped looking up. On the 5th day, someone slipped a piece of bread onto the bench behind her. No one saw. No one claimed it. But that night, she sang again. Soft. Barely above a whisper. Just a thread of sound through the sleeping hall. And we all breathed easier. That's how we fought back. Not with knives, with crumbs, with candlelight, with humming. They punished us for using our bodies. But they never learned. The body remembers love longer than it remembers pain. Every lash fades. But the way someone pressed their forehead to yours, that lives forever. I knew a boy who flinched at kindness. He'd been caught once, holding someone's hand during a funeral. They'd shaved his head, locked him in a room with no light, no food for 3 days. After that, he stopped speaking. I sat beside him for weeks, said nothing. Then one night, I hummed a tune. Just a few notes. Nothing more. He didn't look at me, but the next night he hummed back. We built a language in song. No words, just tones. Shared, back and forth, like passing water in the desert. That was survival, and it was rebellion. They said the soul was eternal, but they treated the body like it was the devil's invention. Anything soft was suspicious. A sigh, a held gaze, a finger left resting too long on another's wrist. They taught us to fear ourselves. So we turned inward. We buried our warmth. We folded it beneath robes and ritual. But it still came out, because the body doesn't forget how to need. There was a woman named Morel. She braided her own hair in the same way each morning. Long, slow, careful. And one day, another sister reached out to help her. It was innocent. One hand, a brush of fingers. But someone saw. They were both confined. The helper was questioned. The braid was cut. Morel never braided her hair again. But every morning, she placed the cut ribbon across her pillow. A memorial. A message. It said, "I was touched with kindness, and I will not let you erase it." That ribbon lasted years, until it vanished one night. And when we asked her what happened, she said, "It's safe now. Someone else carries it." They couldn't trace it, because it was no longer cloth. It was story. They punished the flesh to frighten the spirit. But what they never understood was that every punishment became part of our map. A map of who we loved, who we lost, who we refused to forget. There was a monk who had been beaten for writing poems. Not lewd, not even romantic. Just beautiful. Too beautiful. They told him beauty was a distraction, that his words led others into temptation. So he stopped writing. But at night, he whispered verses into the rafters. I heard them, so did others. And we memorized them, carried them inside us. When he was sent away, we took turns reciting his lines beneath our breath during chores. A kind of oral scripture, smuggled by silence. His punishment didn't erase him. It made him unerasable. Some punishments weren't physical. They were architectural. Certain hallways had rules. You couldn't walk too close. You couldn't speak unless spoken to. You couldn't face someone if they stood higher in the order. Even eye contact was rationed. 2 seconds too long? A report? 3? A warning. More than that? Interrogation. They policed the face more than the hands, because the face was honest. The face betrayed hunger before the body ever moved. So we practiced stillness, not out of discipline, out of fear. But sometimes, something slipped through. Like the time Lior smiled at me during Vespers. Not full, not wide, just enough. My chest ached for hours, not because it was wrong, but because it reminded me that joy wasn't illegal, just hidden. And when something hidden shows itself, even for a second, it feels like resurrection. That's why they punished joy so fiercely, because joy is contagious. It spreads faster than doctrine. They gave us rituals to make us feel holy, but we made moments that made us feel human. And sometimes the most human thing was the willingness to suffer for each other. There was a girl who took a beating for someone else's letter. Didn't confess, didn't break, just stood there, bruised and unyielding, and said, "If you need someone to blame, let it be me. I can carry it." We all cried that night. Silently, of course. Tears against stone. Faces turned to walls. They wanted to cleanse us with pain, but they never noticed what bloomed after. Touch became holy. Memory became scripture. Grief became fuel. And love, quiet, coded, forbidden love, became indestructible. Not all punishments were equal. The poor were beaten. The soft-spoken were isolated. But the beautiful, they were watched. Beauty was its own crime. A boy named Cassian had a face like dusk, warm, calm, gentle around the edges, too gentle. They made him wear heavier robes, said the shape of his throat was distracting. They cut his hair short every week, said the curls stirred temptation. He never spoke above a whisper. He folded linens with reverence. He never touched anyone. But it didn't matter, because desire isn't always about what's done. Sometimes it's about what could be. He became a mirror. Everyone's longing was projected onto him. And when they couldn't bear it, they punished him for their own ache. One day, he was sent to the cold cell. 7 days. No fire. No food. No light. When he came out, his hands were trembling. But he smiled. Not for them. For me. It was a cracked smile. Thin. Small. Real. And I knew in that moment that he'd survived not through obedience, but through memory. We made him a coat. Old scraps. Threadbare sleeves. Too short. But every stitch carried a name. Each of us who loved him in silence added one loop. He wore it under his robe. Always. Even when it grew too tight. Even when it frayed at the seams. That coat was never taken from him. Because they never thought to look beneath the surface. That's how we survived. Not by erasing ourselves, but by hiding the sacred in plain sight. Some wounds never broke skin, but they bled anyway. Like the wound of being told your kindness was dangerous, that your longing was sickness, that your warmth could poison the holy. There was a woman named Rema. They caught her singing to another in the garden. Just singing. No touch. No sin. Just a song with her name in it. They said that was seduction. They took Rema's voice. Not literally. But they forbade her from speaking outside confession. 1 word, punishment. 2, removal. So she wrote. Lines in dust, notes in bread crusts, scratches under the table where she once sat. And we read them. We memorized every curve. We started writing back, in symbols, in marks only we knew. And slowly, what they tried to silence became a chorus. One made of crumbs and dust and breath. Because that's how resistance works in a world ruled by shame. It starts small, invisible, but it grows. I once saw 2 monks punished for undue intimacy. The charge? They shared a scarf during winter. 1 scarf, 2 necks. Too much tenderness. They were whipped in front of us, made to say they had strayed from the path of holiness. But their eyes never left each other. And when it was over, one passed the other, a single thread, torn from that same scarf. It was red. That thread lived inside his pocket until the day he died. They thought pain could destroy us. But pain only made us remember harder. We did not survive because they spared us. We survived because we refused to vanish. Every punishment they gave us, we turned it into a monument. A scar became a map. A silence became a song. A stolen night became a name passed between mouths like communion. You can't kill something that keeps telling the truth. And the truth was simple. We loved. Clumsily. Desperately. Quietly. Fully. Not always with bodies. Often with glances. With gifts. With presence. With the unwavering decision to see each other, even when the rules demanded we look away. The price of pleasure? It was high. Bruises. Isolation. Exile. Burial. But the cost of denial? That was higher. Because it turned us to stone. Made us forget the taste of joy. Made us fear the very thing that made us real. So we chose pain over erasure. We chose memory over obedience. We chose to carry one another in scars, in songs, in secret thread-stitched robes, when the world told us to carry nothing. They called us sinners, but they buried us like saints. And when they came to clean our beds, they found dried tears in the straw, folded notes behind the beams, and names carved into the underside of silence. We left reminders everywhere, because we had to, because we knew someone would come after us. Someone with the same hunger, the same warmth, the same dangerous softness. And we wanted them to know. You are not wrong. You are not disgusting. You are not alone. Let them write the punishments in stone. We wrote our love into air. And it's still here. Can you feel it? That small fire in your chest when someone touches your wrist just right. That ache behind your ribs when you hear a song that makes no sense, but still feels like home. That's us. That's the memory of 1,000 forbidden gestures, still echoing, still waiting, still holding you. They say war leaves no room for tenderness, no room for softness, no time for love, only orders, steel, and silence. But they forget, every soldier still carries a heart, even when it's hidden behind iron, even when it's bruised from battles no one else sees. Let me tell you a story about two men who met not in a chapel or a bed, but in the mud. One wore red, the other blue. They were enemies, on paper, but not in breath, not in silence, not when their eyes met across a broken field and said, "Please, see me." His name was Corwin, Knight of the Iron Banner. He moved like thunder when he fought, but off the field, his hands trembled just slightly when he lit a candle. The other was Aldrich. He served the opposing side, one of the king's whisper guard, trained in silence, precise, deadly. They met at a prisoner exchange, 10 men for 10 men, no weapons, no eye contact. But Aldrich looked, just once, across the line, straight into Corwin's face, and Corwin didn't look away. Later, they would call it foolish, but in that moment, it was freedom. For weeks after, they fought on opposite sides of the same river. Steel met steel, blood met dust. But when night came, their eyes would find each other across the firelight. No words, no promises, just knowing. Then, one night, fate played its cruelest hand. Corwin was captured, taken by Aldrich's men, shackled, bound, brought before the commander. And it was Aldrich who was told to question him. But he didn't speak. Not for hours. He just watched Corwin, studied the way the blood dried on his collar, how his lips split when he smiled without meaning to. Then, softly, Aldrich said, "Did you mean it? That look?" Corwin nodded, didn't blink, didn't breathe, just nodded once. Aldrich cut his bonds that night. He said nothing, just left the door unlatched, and Corwin escaped into the woods. But what neither expected was that Corwin would come back. Corwin returned under cover of fog, not with a sword, with bread. He found the edge of Aldrich's camp, waited behind a ruined wall, left the bundle wrapped in cloth with a small symbol etched in ash, an old soldier's code. It meant, "I remember." He didn't wait to see if Aldrich took it, just vanished back into shadow. But 2 nights later, Corwin found something at the foot of the old elm tree where he once slept. A blade, a red scarf, and a folded note that read, "They're watching, but I see you still." That was how it began. Their war wasn't the one on the battlefield. It was between duty and ache, between silence and speech, between what they swore to protect and what they could no longer deny. They met in the ruins of a chapel once burned during a border siege. Only broken pillars remained, a shattered altar, and ivy climbing the stone like a secret no one dared erase. That's where they touched for the first time, not with hunger, with recognition. Hands on armor, fingers learning scars, breaths catching not from lust, but from the unbearable relief of finally being seen. Neither of them said, "I love you," because war teaches you that words are fragile. But the silence between them, it was unbreakable. For weeks they met only when fate allowed. A missed patrol here, a false trail there, messages left in firewood or scratched into stones. Each moment together felt like a stolen lifetime. And still, they knew. It couldn't last. It was never just the danger. It was the waiting. Waiting for a look. Waiting for the sky to darken. Waiting for a sound in the trees that meant he's here. Every second was fragile, but every second was worth it. One night, Aldrich arrived with blood on his sleeve. Not his. He wouldn't say whose. Wouldn't speak at all. So Corwin undid his armor. Not quickly. Slow. Careful. As if the weight of it could shatter him if taken too fast. He washed Aldrich's hands in silence, wrapped the wound, warmed the room. And when Aldrich finally looked at him, broken, wide-eyed, furious at something no one could name, Corwin said only this: "You don't have to be anyone right now. Not here." That was the first time Aldrich wept. Later, when they lay side by side on bare stone, sharing heat, their foreheads touching, Corwin whispered, "I never believed in peace. Not until I met you in the middle of war." They didn't sleep that night, not because of fear, because they didn't want to miss a second of the only peace they'd ever known. But the world outside kept moving, and war doesn't care about love. A patrol spotted them leaving the ruins days later, a scout with sharp eyes, a bow, and no mercy. Corwin took the arrow, straight to the ribs, but he lived. Aldrich carried him 12 miles through ash and pine, used false names, paid silence with blood. And when Corwin awoke, it was in a healer's hut. Aldrich beside him, silent, pale, and holding his hand like it was the last part of the world he still trusted. They kissed then, not in passion, in survival, because when the world tries to take everything, sometimes the only rebellion left is to touch gently. Corwin healed slowly, breathing hurt, laughter hurt, even love, quiet, steady love, hurt. But Aldrich never left. He sharpened blades in the doorway, warmed broth by fire, spoke only when Corwin couldn't stand the silence. And once, when the wind rattled the walls and made the candles flicker, Corwin whispered, "Do you regret it?" Aldrich didn't answer right away. He looked at the scar forming across Corwin's ribs. He traced it with one finger, then kissed it, just once, and said, "No, because for once, I am bleeding for something that loves me back." Outside, the armies marched. Inside, they built something quieter, a bed made of straw and linen, a space where armor was not allowed, a pact without ink, without vow, but sealed in breath and bone. They talked about running, far east, beyond the marshes, where no banners flew. But every plan ended the same. The war was too big, too close, too cruel. And both of them knew. Love can't always escape. Sometimes it has to endure. Aldrich returned to his army when Corwin could walk again, and Corwin returned to his. No farewell, just one final night, one final touch, and one promise. When the war ends, I'll find you. But promises don't always survive war. The next battle came like thunder. No warning, no retreat, just cold steel and mud soaked in memory. Corwin fought on the southern flank. Aldrich led a midnight raid. Neither knew they were only yards apart, until a horn sounded, a cry, a clash, and then silence. Corwin found the field after dawn, bodies, smoke, the smell of iron and fire. He walked with numb legs, calling no names, just listening. Then he saw it, a red scarf, torn, wrapped around the hilt of a broken blade. Aldrich's blade, but no body, no blood, just absence. Corwin collapsed, fell to his knees in mud that smelled like death. He didn't scream. He just whispered the same thing over and over. "Not yet. Please. Not yet." He returned to camp empty-eyed. Didn't eat. Didn't sleep. But he kept the scarf, tied it around his wrist like armor. Weeks passed. Then months. No word. No sign. But the war ended. As all wars do, not with glory, with exhaustion. And still, Corwin waited. He traveled. East, then south. Through towns too small to be remembered. Asking questions with his eyes, not his voice. Always looking. Always hoping. And one night, in a village with no name, a fire burned behind a tavern. Soft music. Old bread. And at the edge of the crowd, a man, wearing a coat too thin for winter. A familiar silence in his posture. Corwin stepped forward, and the man turned. Aldrich. Older. Tired. But whole. Corwin didn't run, didn't shout. Just stood still. As Aldrich crossed the space between them and took his hand. That night, they didn't speak. They just lay side by side under the stars. No armor, no war, no fear. And when Corwin finally slept, he dreamed of nothing. Because for the first time in years, he had nothing left to run from. Peace is louder than war. It doesn't shout, it waits. At night, it hums through floorboards. It moves in the way someone rolls closer without thinking. It lives in shared cups of water, in silent nods, in firelight that doesn't need to chase anything away. Corwin and Aldrich bought a small room above a weaver's shop. They never said, home. They just stayed. Corwin grew vegetables behind the cottage. Aldrich taught local boys how to hold a blade without fear. No one asked about the scarf around Corwin's wrist. No one asked why Aldrich flinched when the wind sounded like a horn. And still, they never said love. They said, I'll be back before dark. You left the kettle too long again. I kept the bread warm. But under it all, woven into the ordinary, was the vow they never made, but never broke. I will stay. Even now. Corwin woke often from dreams. Sometimes he saw the battlefield. Sometimes he saw Aldrich's body lying still in the snow. Aldrich never woke him. Just reached for his hand and waited. That was their ritual. And some nights, Aldrich stood at the window long after Corwin fell asleep, watched the stars, whispered old names. He never explained who they were, and Corwin never asked. Because love, real love, knows that not all wounds require stitching. Some just need witnessing. And for all their silence, they saw everything in each other. Years passed, not quickly, but not slowly either. Time softened the scars, but it didn't erase them. Corwin's hair went gray at the temples. Aldrich walked with a slight limp after a fall on winter ice. But the love? It stayed young. They grew a garden behind the cottage. Tomatoes. Mint. A tree that never quite bore fruit, but gave them shade every summer. Every year, on the anniversary of the last battle. They didn't speak. They walked to the old burned chapel, the ruins where they first kissed. They lit one candle, left no offering, said no prayer, just stood, side by side, in the memory. One year, Corwin left something else, his old gauntlet, cracked, faded, still smelling faintly of leather and smoke. He placed it at the altar and whispered, I won't need this anymore. Aldrich said nothing, just took his hand and led him home. Later that night, Corwin sat by the fire and asked, if we had met after the war, would you still have loved me? Aldrich smiled, not a big one, a knowing one. And he said, we didn't love despite the war. We loved through it. That's what made it real. Corwin looked into the fire, then back at him, and said, you're the only battle I was glad to lose. They slept in the same bed that night, as they always did. Only this time, Corwin didn't dream of soldiers. He dreamed of mint leaves, and bare feet in the dirt, and a man's hand reaching for his in daylight, without fear. In the end, it was Aldrich who went first, not in battle, in sleep. A quiet morning, tea on the stove, rain at the window. Corwin found him with one hand resting over his chest, still warm, a small smile on his lips, like he'd dreamed something good. Corwin didn't cry right away. He made the tea anyway, lit the fire, sat beside him. Only when the rain stopped did he let go. They buried Aldrich under the tree behind the house, the one that never bore fruit. Corwin said, "He gave shade. That was always enough. No priest, just neighbors, a few old soldiers who remembered the red scarf, and silence. So much silence." Corwin lived 5 years longer, tending the garden, writing small letters to no one, wearing the scarf on cold days. One day, he didn't open the shutter, so the healer found him, seated at the table, eyes closed, hands folded. He was buried beside Aldrich. Same tree, same earth. And the townsfolk planted a second tree between them, one that did bear fruit. Small, sweet, crimson. They called them soldiers' hearts. Some say if you sit under that tree in spring, you'll hear two voices in the wind, one cautious, one calm, laughing. And if you listen closely, really listen, you'll hear them say, "It was worth it." Every scar, every silence, every second. Because not all war stories end in ruin. Some end in return, some in rest, and some in love. Quiet, defiant, forbidden love that outlives the very sword that tried to cut it down. They called it courtly love. But in truth, it was courtly danger. Because in royal halls, a misplaced glance could become a scandal, a breath too close, treason, a touch, death. And yet, they still loved. Kings, queens, knights, ladies, even the scribes behind the tapestries. Because desire doesn't bow to crowns. Let me tell you about a queen. Her name was Isolwyn, born to a winter palace, married by 13, crowned before she learned what desire was. She was a queen in name, but a prisoner in silk, until she met the falconer. Not a lord, not a noble, just a man who whispered to birds and knew how to look without staring. He taught her the language of wings, how to call a hawk with a whistle, how to wrap her wrist in leather, how to listen to the wind before it spoke. And when their fingers brushed just once, she felt something more honest than every vow in her wedding bed. Their meetings were brief, always by accident, always watched, but every look said, "I know you." One night, she left her ring by the aviary door. Inside the band, a scratch. "If you find this, I'm still yours." It was a risk, but love at court always was. He returned the ring a week later, tied to a falcon's foot. The bird landed on her window ledge at dusk, stared at her like it knew her secrets. And in that moment, she wasn't a queen. She was just Isolwyn, the woman who chose. Their affair was never written in letters. Ink could be stolen. Paper could burn. So they wrote in shadow. One tilt of the head meant, "Meet me by the west tower." A dropped glove meant, "Not tonight." 3 fingers resting on a goblet meant, "They suspect." It was enough. Because when you're starving, even crumbs taste like feasts. The queen and the falconer met where no one thought to look, above the stables, beneath the prayer loft, in the garden maze, between the yew and the bleeding hearts. They never spoke of forever, just now, because royals never got to keep what they loved, only borrow it before the crown took it back. He once kissed the inside of her wrist, not out of lust, out of reverence, as if to say, "Even if they cut off this hand, I'll remember its warmth." She never cried with him. But when he left each night, she held the scarf he gave her and pressed it to her lips. Only for comfort, for courage, because secrets need armor too. Then came the tournament, a parade of men in steel and polished pride, dukes, knights, lords, And one foreign prince with ambition in his smile. He wanted a queen. He wanted Iselwyn. And the court? They wanted peace. So they arranged it. Behind curtains, over wine, through gritted teeth. The falconer heard first, from a stable boy who owed him a favor. He didn't weep. He rode. To the edge of the kingdom, to the cliffs where birds dared the wind. He released every falcon that day, and sent one back with a ribbon tied to its leg. The scarf she'd once worn, folded, silent. When it landed on her windowsill, Iselwyn didn't speak. She untied it, held it, pressed her lips to the knot, then lit it on fire. Not in hatred, in mourning. She married the prince a month later. The court cheered, the bells rang, and in every painting she smiled. But she never entered the aviary again, not even once. Because some lovers you don't bury. You keep them alive by refusing to look where they once stood. Now let me tell you about a prince, heir to 3 kingdoms, promised to a duchess, but in love with his bodyguard. Her name was Vera. Tall, quiet, eyes like thunder before it broke. She'd killed 7 men before the age of 20, and yet, around him, she softened. The prince, Elion, wore silk. Vera wore blood. But they understood each other, because both had been trained to hide behind armor. One of steel, one of smiles. They shared stories in empty corridors, played chess in the barracks, taught each other how to breathe without flinching. And one day, in the training yard, he let her win. Not because he was weak, because he wanted her to touch him. She did. Sword at his throat, eyes locked, but her hand trembled. That night, they didn't speak, just stood in the candlelight, each waiting for the other to make it real. Vera kissed him first, hard, quick, afraid. Elion kissed her second, slower, like it would be the only time. They met often after that, never in beds, always on stone floors, under banners, beside open windows where the stars could watch. He gave her a ring, carved from bone. She gave him a scar, across the ribs, disguised as an accident during training. He wore it proudly. But secrets don't stay secrets in royal halls. A servant saw, spoke, and soon so did the Queen Mother. She ordered Vera removed, not killed, just erased. Elion tried to stop them. But heirs do not have power, only titles. They dragged Vera from her post, not even a goodbye. Elion found her sword days later, laid across his bed. No note, just a single strand of her hair tied to the hilt. He never loved again. He married, as expected. Fathered children. Ruled wisely. But he slept beside a sword for the rest of his life. And every year, on the eve of Vera's exile, he left a candle burning at the edge of the barracks. For her. For the memory of a love never allowed, but never forgotten. Some say the most dangerous love of all is between 2 queens. One ruled the mountains, the other, the coast. Their kingdoms shared nothing but a border and suspicion, until a winter summit brought them together. 3 days. 1 fortress. Too much silence. Queen Roswyn wore furs like armor. Queen Selene wore silver like it meant nothing. Their first meeting was icy. Their second, shorter. But the third? Selene laughed. Just once. Low, sharp, real. And Roswyn smiled like she hadn't in years. They dined privately that night. No scribes, no guards. Just 2 women who ruled too much, and had given up too much to get there. Selene poured the wine. Roswyn set down her knife, and with no warning, no speech, no apology, Selene leaned across the table and kissed her. Roswyn didn't pull away. She just whispered, "I thought I was the bold one." They didn't meet again for 6 months, not until the spring thaw, when a trade caravan crossed the border. But inside the lead carriage, Roswyn, in disguise, alone. She stayed a week. They spoke by day, touched by night, and parted with no promises. Only one letter remains from their affair, hidden in the lining of a mirror frame, found a century later. It reads, "You cannot have me, but you did, and that will always be enough." When Celine died, she was buried in a tomb beside her husband. But her ring, the one with the emerald crest of the Mountain Kingdom, was found beneath her pillow. As for Roswin, she never married. She said her heart had been claimed by a storm, and no other wind could move her again. That is the way of royal love. Hidden, fierce, brief, but never truly gone. Because even under a crown, the heart still remembers what it wasn't allowed to keep. They say monasteries are quiet places, stone halls, chanted prayers, cloisters of silence and submission. But that's not the whole story. Not even close. Because behind those cold walls, desire whispered louder than any hymn. Let me tell you about a brother named Talon. He took the cloth at 17, shaved his head, bit his tongue, buried every spark of feeling beneath scripture and ash. But nothing kills longing forever, especially not in places built to bury it. Brother Talon kept his gaze low, his voice soft, his fingers folded in obedience, until Brother Caius arrived, new, stern, with ink-stained hands and a voice like the sea. They were assigned to the same cell during winter, one cot, one basin, one fire. No secrets. They didn't speak much at first, just silence between pages, shared bread, breath rising in cold air. But something shifted one night. When Caius reached out and brushed frost from Talon's cheek, it was nothing. A moment. Gone like a breath. But that night, Talon dreamt of warmth, and the next morning, he smiled. The second touch wasn't an accident. It came days later. While they washed linen in the stone basin, cold water, cracked skin, Talon flinched. Not from the cold, from the heat that sparked where their hands met beneath the water. Caius didn't apologize. He only said, "Some things are not meant to freeze." That night, they lay awake. Neither spoke, but their breathing matched. Soft, measured, as if trying to hear the other's heartbeat through the walls. It was weeks before anything more happened. Desire in the monastery is slow, measured. It arrives like a shadow and lingers like incense in old wood. They found ways to be near, not obvious, but enough. Passing the candle slower than needed, brushing cloaks too close in chapel halls, looking up at just the wrong or right moment during morning hymns. And then one night, Talon woke to find Caius already watching him, their faces inches apart. Neither moved, neither breathed, until Caius whispered, "I have prayed for this silence, and still, I want to break it." Talon reached out, took his hand, and the world, for one moment, did not punish them. There was no kiss, no fire, just fingers folded into fingers. Two vows trembling, two men no longer pretending, and that was enough. Spring came early that year. The snow melted fast, the garden beds thawed, and with the thaw came risk. The others began to notice, not the touches, not the looks, but the stillness between them, like something unspoken had taken root. Brother Matteo was first to question, a small word, a pointed pause. "You two seem close." Talon only nodded, smiled the way monks do when hiding storms. But the walls had ears, and whispers move faster than truth. They were watched, assigned to different duties, given fewer hours together. But the heart doesn't obey timetables, and love, once awakened, doesn't sleep. They met behind the cloister bell, only minutes at a time. No words, just foreheads pressed together, and a single breath shared between them. Caius began writing again. Poems, small ones, folded and hidden beneath floorboards. Talon found them, read each one in silence. One line stayed with him. "The holiest thing I've ever touched was your hand." Then came the inspection. A bishop, an audit, a test of purity. Rooms searched, robes examined, journals opened. They didn't find the poems, but they found Talon's drawing. Small, charcoal, the curve of a man's mouth, Caius's. Enough to raise questions, enough to separate them. They were summoned, not together. One by one, asked what had passed between them, how long, how far, how deeply. Talon said nothing. So did Caius. And in that silence, they were condemned, not to death. Worse, to separation. Caius was reassigned to a mountain abbey, far north, cold, unreachable. Talon stayed, but the room felt empty for months after. He continued to wake at dawn, fold 2 blankets instead of 1, look at the bed across from his, and feel its weight. He never saw Caius again, but he found one last poem, scratched faintly into the underside of the basin. "If the Lord sees all, let him see this love and not strike it down." Years, Pisorio said. The monastery aged, walls cracked, new brothers arrived, old names faded. But Talon remained. He rose before dawn, tended the gardens, copied scripture, slept beside an empty bed. No one asked about his silence anymore. It became part of the stone, a habit, a legend. But every year, on the first night of spring, he left a folded scrap of parchment inside the bell tower. Never signed, never claimed. Just 3 words. Still with you. One winter, Talon fell ill. Not sudden, just slow. Like a candle giving itself away. He asked to be moved to the old cell, the one where he and Caius once shared silence. They let him, and on his final night, he whispered something into the dark. "Forgive me for surviving it alone." In the morning, he was gone, but beside his bed, one feather, black, clean, untouched by time. No birds lived in the monastery that winter. No one could explain it, and no one tried. They buried Talon in the courtyard, under a small tree that never quite grew straight. And every spring after that, a single black-feathered bird perched on the sill outside that cell. It never sang, it only waited. Because some loves don't need sound. They echo in silence. They last, even behind stone, even beneath vows, even when the world says no. Power is rarely clean, and love, when mixed with it, almost always ends in blood. Let me tell you about Duchess Seralina. Elegant, ruthless, educated in poisons before she was taught her prayers. She ruled a corner of the southern coast. Gold mines, trade routes, a name that made men bow before they understood why. But she kept no husband, no heirs, no suitors, only one companion, a maid named Elise. Plain, quiet, the kind of woman who passed unnoticed through palaces, except by the one who needed her most. Seralina loved her, not with ceremony, with constancy. Every night Elise brushed her hair. Every morning she laced the Duchess's corset, fingers trembling less each year. They shared no chamber, but they shared everything else. One evening, during a feast meant for warlords and kings, Seralina dropped her goblet, clutching her throat, eyes wide, tears forming, not from pain, but fury. Elise was at her side in seconds, and Seralina whispered, "Not yours." "I know." The cup was poisoned, meant for her, meant by one of the men smiling at her across the hall. But Seralina survived, not because of luck, because she had been drinking poison in trace doses for years. Preparing. Later that night, she found Elise in the servants' wing, and for the first time in all their hidden years, she kissed her. Long, tired, full of something final. Then said, If they come for me tomorrow, run. Elise didn't. She stayed. And when the guards broke into the Duchess's room the next night, they found both women gone. No blood. No bodies. Just a note on the windowsill. You poisoned the wrong heart. Some say they died at sea. Others say they escaped east, living in silence, teaching Gur else to write their own stories. But in the capital, a single dagger was found, wedged into the throne room door a week later. Silver, clean, and carved into the hilt. Sarah Lena and Elise. They never ruled again. But their names, still whispered, especially by women who dream of love sharper than power. Because in the end, some loves don't burn quietly. They cut, and they survive.